prosecutors describe as a seemingly misguided effort to evade detection by law enforcement.
Now, if you find the idea of a woman, not least a privileged, educated woman, allegedly doing something like this so shocking as to be almost incredible, well, you're not alone. Many of Ghislaine's friends, who go back years, have told me privately that they're just stunned. Where had the clever, glittering, Oxford-educated woman that they'd known gone? Who was this alleged monster? Now, many of those people are not saying this publicly. Some have already had their livelihoods severely damaged simply because they knew her. But one of her close friends was willing to go on the record with me. Christopher Mason. He happens to be one of my friends, and he's also a journalist. So like me, he's eager to understand the truth. I went with my producer to talk to Christopher at his home. It was brightly decorated with orange.
I'm obsessed with orange. Yeah, it's orange sapphire. It's all very orange downstairs, with the orange zebras and stuff.
Christopher told me that the last time he had seen Ghislaine was 5 or 6 years ago, and it was at a fancy party.
It seemed entirely normal to run into Ghislaine at a splashy event like that. But I hadn't seen her for quite a while, and so I was delighted to see my old friend.
I remember seeing her at that party too. As usual, it was always the same story with Ghislaine, where, she hard to pin down, traveling the world, piloting a submarine, hanging out with Bill Clinton or whoever.
Yes.
I think the truth of it is we knew so little about her in a way. She would breeze in, dominate a room and breeze out.
Absolutely.
Other of her British friends who she was much closer to, the truth of it is that actually they had no idea of any of this because she was careful, it seems in hindsight, to keep Jeffery out of their lives. She did not bring him to dinner. And so I think a lot of her former friends are sad and upset and angry.
Yeah, for good reason.
There's an element of I think they feel betrayed, actually. Shocked and betrayed.
Yeah, absolutely.
Christopher first met Ghislaine in 1989. It was at a party she was hosting in New York.
I wrote in my diary that night that I'd met Ghislaine Maxwell, the daughter of the notorious Sir Robert.
He was really captivated.
And that she was bright, extremely entertaining, very engaging, great fun, and I really hoped I would see her again.
When did you come across her next?
I ran into Ghislaine, I think it was sometime early in 1991, and I was delighted to see her again, and she said that she had just moved to New York and that her father had bought the Daily News and that she was going to be working for him in the city. She was a naturally great connector because she was so engaging and so bright, and that she was cutting her way for her father to arrive and meet extraordinary people.
Now, I first met Ghislaine at a party too. This one was in the late 1990s, not too long after I'd moved here from London. Those were the days when networking at night was part of what New York was all about, or at least it was in my world. When I first saw Ghislaine, she was standing next to the hostess. She was receiving people like it was her party. She was a pin-thin brunette with an accent just like mine, and she radiated energy and charm. When she talked to you, you felt that she was completely absorbed in you and in the moment. I don't remember what we talked about. All I do remember is that she made me feel like the nerd who'd just been invited to join the cool kids table. But at the same time, there was an awful lot I didn't know about this magnetic woman.
It just seems staggering to realize that this person who struck me as such a live wire seemed so delightful and engaging when I first met her in November 1989, that she had now become sort of one of the most hated women in the world.
So imagine, This jet-setting, designer-loving woman. She's sitting alone in her cell, facing extremely serious charges. How did this happen? Back when I first met her, right up until I began reporting on Jeffery, believe it or not, I had absolutely no idea that Ghislaine had any connection to Jeffrey Epstein. In fact, I didn't know who Jeffrey Epstein was. Ghislaine was out with other men, or by herself. But now, as Ghislaine's secrets are starting to emerge, so too are the secrets of other powerful people in Ghislaine and Jeffrey's orbit. They're almost all men, whose connection to Jeffrey seems strange, inexplicable almost. Now, these are some of the richest and most influential people in the world. Take Leon Black, net worth $8 billion. He paid Jeffrey around $160 million in fees after Jeffrey went to jail for sex charges in 2008. And then there's Bill Gates, one of the world's biggest philanthropists. He had to explain publicly why he had visited frequently with Jeffrey after Jeffrey had served his jail term. Gates claimed ignorance about Jeffrey's convictions. But according to the Wall Street Journal, Gates's wife Melinda divorced him in 2021 over his connections to Jeffrey. A spokesperson for Gates has denied this. Other reported Jeffrey guests include the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, colloquially known as MBS. There was a picture of him in Jeffrey's house. There were also photographs of Ehud Barak, the former Israeli Prime Minister, dropping in there. Then there's Leslie Wexner, the billionaire businessman who's behind 90s mall favorites, such as Victoria's Secret, Abercrombie & Fitch, The Limited Express, and Bath & Body Works. Wexner and his former board are now being sued by a shareholder for allegedly ignoring Jeffrey's predatory behavior. There are other powerful people caught up in Jeffrey's web whose identities I've only recently learned, and you'll hear about them. But at the center of this web is Ghislaine Maxwell. She knows about Epstein's money, where it really came from, why it protected him for 3 decades from facing any meaningful accountability for his sexual depravity. Ghislaine has a choice to make at her upcoming trial. Tom Bauer, who wrote a biography about Ghislaine's father, says,
"The lawyers will be fighting hard. What their defense is, I can't tell you right now, but she's going to actually put up a huge fight, in my view."
So how will Ghislaine fight? Will she go on the offensive and try to discredit her accusers? Will she rat out the elite group of men who enabled Jeffrey and his crimes? Will she tell prosecutors all of their secrets in an attempt to save herself? Back in 2002, when I first started reporting this story, of course, I knew none of what I'm about to tell you now. I didn't imagine for a second that Ghislaine would be a central character in Jeffrey's story. But that was about to change. One could possibly say that the story I'm reporting on today would never have come to be without this man, Robert Maxwell. He was Ghislaine's father, yes, but he was also the key to understanding how Jeffrey built his fortune. And he was the bond between his favorite daughter and Jeffrey. You may remember that he died in 1991 under very strange circumstances.
The publisher, Robert Maxwell, is missing at sea, feared lost overboard from his motor yacht. The yacht was cruising off the coast of Tenerife when the captain reported that Mr. Maxwell had disappeared.
And it was soon after that suspicious death that Jeffery suddenly had enough money to buy a vast ranch in New Mexico, a mansion in New York, a private plane, and later an entire island. It was so much, so fast. Where did this money come from? There were many rumors. In 2002, Jeffery told me that he had never met Robert Maxwell.
I never met the father. I stayed totally away from anything to do with... My view is to have respect for my friends and their problems. I simply provided sort of a welcome port for comfort. I think there were enough people talking to her about her father.
So I hadn't pursued this thread any further. There are still well-placed skeptics who say that there is no record of the two men meeting. But I have other sources who say that Jeffrey Epstein and Robert Maxwell may well have known each other. One person says that he has direct knowledge that they did. Two others say that Jeffrey told them that they did. A fourth is Ed Epstein, no relation to Jeffrey. Ed is a journalist who I've known for many years, and he's also a paid consultant for this podcast.
Jeffrey knew Maxwell. He told one of his close friends that he knew Maxwell before he knew Ghislaine. So he bragged that he knew him. So we don't know anything about Jeffrey because Jeffrey would lie as well as tell the truth. But he did tell people that he knew Maxwell. And that even he claims, although I don't know it's at all true, Maxwell introduced him to his daughter.
So I went back to look at Robert Maxwell and any possible connections to Jeffrey that might have tied Jeffrey to Ghislaine, visibly and invisibly. I'm Vicky Ward, and this is Chasing Ghislaine. Episode 3, The Father. Robert Maxwell was tall, dark, and charismatic. In middle age, he became vastly overweight, but this didn't dampen his magnetism. Women, moguls, and obviously his family craved his attention.
The point about Robert Maxwell is that he was a global colossus.
Tom Bauer wrote one of Robert Maxwell's biographies.
And also, you've got to understand something also special about the Maxwells. The Maxwells don't believe in fleeing. Robert Maxwell was a fighter, a survivor, a man of great courage.
But Robert Maxwell also had a dark side.
Robert Maxwell was totally unscrupulous.
Martin Dillon co-authored the book Robert Maxwell, Super Spy.
He was narcissistic. He was very transactional.
Like his death, Maxwell's life was a mystery. He was a modern-day Renaissance man with fingers in so many pies it was hard to keep up. He was a tycoon and a media mogul, as well as a crook, with close ties to foreign intelligence agencies.
He was a man who had huge media interest, but also huge political relationships with the President of America, Israel, Germany, Russia, Britain, France, and everything. His business was to steal money.
Much of his success was built on graft and lies, especially in his final years when his debts topped $1 billion. Maxwell engaged in shady accounting practices. He shuffled around loans, he misled banks and creditors, he stole from his own companies, all in an effort to keep his struggling media empire afloat and to keep up appearances. Maxwell's notorious ambition can be put down in part to formative childhood experiences. He was born to an extremely poor family in Czechoslovakia in the 1920s. The other members of his family were murdered in Auschwitz. He was the lone survivor. When he turned 17, he left home. He joined the French army.
I led Czech volunteers out of what was Czechoslovakia across Hungary into Yugoslavia.
This is Robert Maxwell in a BBC interview.
Guided them by train up to the Yugoslav border on the way to joining the voluntary Czech army in France.
Maxwell ended up in Britain. He got married and had 9 children. The youngest was his favourite, Ghislaine. Here's author Martin Dillon again.
He treated other children very badly. He never treated her badly. And you can see the photographs of where she's at a football match with him. And it's quite apparent that he really loves this young girl, right, as his daughter. And he names his yacht the Lady Ghislaine.
He made it clear that when his children wanted to get married, he had to approve of not just the spouse, but even the date, time, and venue of the nuptials. Inevitably, the children lied to their parents, their father in particular. Ghislaine hid the fact that she held parties on his yacht. She had to beg the boat's captain to stay silent. Tom Bauer.
The point about Ghislaine's deception of her father is this. Her father was a tyrant. He demanded utter obedience. He demanded the most ludicrous discipline from grown-up children. The only way they could operate, whether it was in the use of the properties of his yacht or his planes or anything, was to lie to him about what they were doing. If they were caught, they knew that his anger would be horrendous. But that was the only way the Maxwells knew how to operate, was by lying. I think that Ghislaine was living with a monster, a very brutal man. Her father was very violent in his authoritarian way. He treated people appallingly, not least his children. And he was a serial crook. She didn't know the difference between morality and immorality in the way of upbringing, in my view.
Maxwell shouted at his children for the smallest of things. He once made Ghislaine cry because she told him about a dinner she had attended on his behalf in New York, and he yelled at her that her, quote, report was not detailed enough for him. I suppose he felt he'd earned the right to shout. I'll give Maxwell this. He worked hard, very hard. When he first arrived in Britain, he barely spoke the language, but that didn't seem to slow him down one bit. During his time in the army, Maxwell had networked, and eventually he bought his first company in 1951, the Pergamon Press. It published scientific papers. And once that business was off and thriving, he went into politics. He spent 5 years in Parliament as a Labour Party member.
And when I got into the House of Commons for the first time, I thought I was the cleverest thing on 2 legs there. And it was rather sobering to discover in a few weeks that anything I knew, there were at least 10 people that knew 1,000 times more. Brings you down to size.
He failed to win re-election. Undaunted, he set about trying to buy a British newspaper. That's no small feat for someone not born into Britain's upper classes. In 1984, he bought a group of newspapers, including the tabloid The Daily Mirror. He'd later buy the New York Daily News, which would cement his place as a global media mogul. He'd also buy the language instruction company, Berlitz International. He was a man who liked to show off his money. He had a mansion in Oxford, a Gulfstream jet, a helicopter, a yacht that was over half the length of a football field. He named it the Lady Ghislaine. But despite all this, Robert Maxwell was never accepted by the British establishment. Some people even viewed Maxwell as a Russian intelligence asset, particularly because of the very first business that Maxwell had acquired, the Pergamon Press.
According to reports in 2 national newspapers, Pergamon Press is one of 45 companies listed as so-called friendly firms in a confidential report of the Soviet Communist Party.
Pergamon Press has never been formally accused of espionage. But according to 2 sources, it might well have given Maxwell a very good cover to pass cutting-edge information on to other governments. Through its publishing of scientific papers, Maxwell could easily find out about the technological innovations in foreign countries. Martin Dillon says that the Pergamon Press also gave Maxwell the opportunity to be in contact with heads of state in the former Eastern Bloc countries.
And he was, going to sort of the leaders of countries like in Bulgaria, to Todor Zhivkov, the despot there, and saying, I would love to sort of have your sort of autobiography published. I would love to have a big book, published about you, because people should really know about you. He did the same with Ceausescu in Romania. He was going in and out of, Moscow in the KGB headquarters.
According to Tom Bauer, back in Britain, Maxwell was considered a shady businessman, but
he always got away. He'd always talked his way out and bamboozled and bulldozed the opposition and the authorities aside because he was so courageous, purposeful, ruthless, a gambler and all the rest of it.
At home, Robert Maxwell was often the opposite of charming. He cheated frequently on his wife, Betty, and he once told a lover that he didn't even like most of his children. But Betty was not especially affectionate towards her children either, says Tom Bauer.
Well, I think Betty was a very cold, austere woman who had collaborated with Robert Maxwell's brutality towards his children, never protested when he beat them and all the rest of it, and also knew all the time about his frauds. The Betty I knew was not someone who Ghislaine would have confided in. The thing about the Maxwell children, from what I could see, they didn't confide in anyone. There's no weakness. They're never weak. They prove themselves by being stubbornly strong. That is their survival gene.
Martin Dillon, the other biographer, says Maxwell treated his children much like his employees. Famously, he spied on them.
The guy, in many ways, was a monster. He treated his children the way he treated the people who worked for him. The people who worked for him, he'd take them. He had, he had cameras in their offices. He had kept files on them. He treated people appallingly. He had absolutely no manners. This is the man who, could have maybe a jar full of beluga caviar and stick his hands into it and eat the caviar. I mean, he was grotesque at times, and yet he was a very, very sophisticated man. He spoke several languages, was highly intelligent, and was very impressive.
Maxwell himself admitted that people, including his family, mattered much less than work and success.
Whatever you do, you must give it total concentration and commitment. And if you are out selling, for instance, and it's 5 o'clock and you have a date with your girl, but if you stayed on and walked a further mile, you may talk to a customer and fulfill their requirements, then you better do that rather than going on your date. That's what I've done all my life. And that's also what I'm trying to teach my children or anybody who asks me for advice.
Is that what separates the successful person from the pack?
Yes, it separates the achiever from the talker. It's the doer. A lot of people will talk to you about what they want to do, but never really do it. If you want to do it, you must get on with it and be single-minded.
Even though Ghislaine was supposedly Maxwell's favorite, he still didn't treat her well. Some of her closest friends from Oxford talked to me about their relationship, but only on the condition of anonymity for fear of losing both financial and social standing. They told me about how they used to dread her invitations to stay the weekend at Headington Hill Hall, the Maxwell mansion. One friend recalled how Ghislaine openly craved her father's attention, rushing to him and asking to introduce her friends to him, but he'd say, "I don't need to know who they are," and push her away. This same friend remembered that her father once strolled into the living room where she was playing chess. He just nonchalantly moved her piece for her without asking. He was obsessed with power plays, this person told me. But the Maxwell children came to rely on the perks that came with their father, even though they never forgot that only he was in total control of these. It was his plane they used for trips abroad, his helicopter, his yacht, and his connections. Here's Tom again.
When Robert Maxwell bought the New York Daily News, he was immediately a huge personality in New York. So his daughter was able to exploit that remarkable passport to the celebrities and used it. And so she would get invited to all the best parties, would know about all the major events, and if she wanted to go, would get an invitation. And so that carried on after his death. She'd made all the relationships she needed by then.
The early, untarnished Ghislaine had a lot of friends back in 1991. Pretty powerful ones. From all over the world, just like her dad. They'd often turn up at her New York dinner parties. Remember Ghislaine's friend Christopher Mason? Well, he attended many of those parties.
The megawattage of the guests, very well-connected guests. I remember there was the grandson of Haile Selassie, for instance, was at dinner. Princess Olga of Greece was there. And the Haile Selassie grandson had brought the closest friend of Oliver North. This was the time of Iran-Contra.
North, of course, was a key figure in the 1986 Iran-Contra scandal. He's alleged to have masterminded the part where the US secretly sent funds from arms sales in order to support the Contras in Nicaragua.
All of the names she was dropping, Kissinger's, and it was clearly that she was a naturally great connector.
Ostensibly, Ghislaine was in New York working for her father, although no one saw her do much actual work, which was strange for the Maxwells because they were notoriously hard workers.
There's no doubt, though, that Ghislaine, as Robert Maxwell's favourite child, was given special access to money which perhaps the other sisters would not have got, and was specially looked after.
Ghislaine's job, it seemed, was mainly to network, which she did superbly. And her father asked her to do other odd jobs for him as well. Like the time she took the Concorde from London to New York to pick up an envelope. That envelope contained public shares of Berlitz International stock, which Robert Maxwell would secretly and illegally sell. Now, there's no indication that Ghislaine knew what was in the envelope. In 1991, the Maxwells were at the peak of their influence. But then...
The millionaire publisher Robert Maxwell has died, apparently after falling from his yacht during a cruise in the Canary Islands. Trading in his businesses, Maxwell Communications and Mirror Group newspapers, has been suspended.
After he'd apparently fallen over the guardrail of the Lady Ghislaine in the middle of the night, Maxwell's death was ruled an accident. Most likely that he'd had a heart attack. But many people, even his own family, have subsequently suggested that Robert Maxwell was murdered. His widow, Betty, suggested foul play in her memoir, which was published 3 years after his death. She was quoted by the BBC as saying, "He's been murdered." Ghislaine also told her friend Christopher Mason that she was certain her father had been murdered.
There were reports in the papers, I think, because this allegation of him having been involved with the Israeli intelligence, and there were these theory that the Moss had taken him out because he had displeased them. That was one of the theories around his death. And she seemed convinced that he had been killed.
That's right. Robert Maxwell wasn't just rumoured to be an informant for Britain and Russia. He was also suspected to be an informant for Israel. Here's biographer Martin Dillon again.
Maxwell did a lot of business with the KGB. He did a lot of business with organized crime syndicates. He did a lot of business with Mossad, particularly beginning in the early 1980s until his death in 1991. He also did business with British intelligence, though he didn't agree to work for them full time. So whatever was in his interests, that's what mattered to him.
Mossad, of course, is the Israeli intelligence agency, like their CIA. Here's Tom Bauer.
Maxwell had very, very close relations with Israel the last 3-4 years of his life, not because he was a Mossad agent, but because he felt very, very close to Israel because of his own Orthodox Jewish background, and because he was a very good link between the Israelis and the Russians. And also he bought 2 very, very good investments in Israel from which he made a lot of money.
So you need to remember the context in which Maxwell was making all of these connections. It was in the context of the Iran-Iraq War. If you don't remember that war of the early 1980s, it's a bit of a mind trick, because while Iran is fighting Iraq, countries who would otherwise be enemies, such as Israel and Iran, are quietly doing business with one another. That is, Israel is supplying Iran with weapons. Meanwhile, the Soviets are covertly sending weapons to Iran, but at the same time, they're openly supplying Iraq. So here's Maxwell, close to both the Soviet Union and Israel. The perfect conduit, allegedly, who moves Iranian money without anybody knowing. People close to him, however, deny that he did this. Moreover, it's extremely difficult to confirm that Maxwell was directly involved as an Israeli and Russian asset. But former Mossad agent Viktor Ostrovsky likens Maxwell's role for the Israelis as the equivalent of being a Russian sleeper, somebody whose business and political contacts were a very useful way to pass on information and money. A Mr. Ari Ben-Menashe, a self-described former Israeli military intelligence officer, and others say this as well.
That's how I got to know Maxwell. I was part of the team that was exporting arms to the Iranians during their war against Iraq.
Ostrovsky says that he would characterize Maxwell's involvement with Iran in a different light.
And this I have no doubt. Maxwell could have been supplying arms to the Iranians because the Russians were providing it to him. Yeah, that's completely... He wouldn't have a loyalty to Iran or Iraq.
So the way it supposedly worked was this. The Iranians would send funds to Bahrain, who in turn paid Maxwell, who then paid Israel. All of this has subsequently been reported in news outlets, except for the intimate role that Robert Maxwell allegedly played. Now, this alleged role, according to Ben-Menashe, was that Maxwell was the middleman, moving payments for arms around in the Iran-Iraq war and also involving the Eastern Bloc.
A lot of it was bought from the Soviet Union at the time. And we're sending it to the Iranians. And the Iranians would pay through Maxwell. Paid the Israelis through Robert Maxwell.
It was within this context that Jeffery was allegedly brought under Israel's influence. I'll say more about this in a minute, but I first need to add some caveats about my source, Ari Ben-Menashe. He appears throughout this series for reasons that I hope will become clear. He's anything but a straightforward character. I'll just say that for obvious reasons, it's very hard to find forthcoming, on-the-record sources in the intelligence world. Nonetheless, Ben-Menashe describes himself as a former Israeli military intelligence officer who knew Robert Maxwell, but nobody else has been able to confirm this. Ben-Menashe says that he knows about Maxwell's dealings in the 1980s because Ben-Menashe was also involved in arms dealing for the Israelis in this period. Ben-Menashe's name captured headlines in 1989 when he was caught in the US, trying to broker a sale of US military aircraft to Iran on behalf of Israel. He was charged with violating the US Arms Control Export Act, and he spent a year in a US jail before the case went to trial. His defense argued that he was working for the Israeli government, and a US jury believed that. He was acquitted. But Ben-Menashe has also been caught in uncorroborated claims and untruths. For instance, he has said that he was intimately involved in the Iran-Contra scandal. Not true. And then there's the October surprise. Well, that's now known to be a conspiracy theory that emerged during the Reagan-Carter campaigns. Over the years, the Israeli government has distanced themselves from Ben-Menashe. He eventually landed in Canada and founded a so-called consulting business. Now, this has caught media attention for representing a series of authoritarian and anti-democratic figures. For example, former Prime Minister of Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe. Ben Menashe has also worked for military juntas, like the regime in Myanmar. And as you'll hear later, US intelligence views him as currently representing Israeli state interests in certain countries abroad. He has denied working for the Israelis currently. But remember, other times Ben Menashe connects the dots in a way that simply can't be verified and should be taken with a grain of salt. Given that Jeffrey's death has left so many unresolved questions, conspiracy theories abound, and Ben Menashe's narratives can resemble those. So back to Robert Maxwell's dealings with the Soviets, the Iranians, and the Israelis in the 1980s. It's into this world that Jeffrey Epstein allegedly steps. If 3 of my sources are to be believed, Jeffrey would be brought in to help Israel's national security efforts. The help went far beyond the kind of back-channel diplomacy and money moving that Maxwell had allegedly done for the Israelis. Several of my sources say that Jeffrey used blackmail to promote Israel's interests as part of a massive influence campaign on the United States. Why? Because Jeffrey had become an arms dealer and a money launderer in the Middle East and elsewhere, according to sources. So here's another little piece of history that you need to know in order to understand how Jeffrey got here. While the Iran-Iraq war raged in the early 1980s, the biggest arms deal ever was going down between the British and the Saudis. El Yamama. It's now infamous for how corrupt it was. Jeffrey was working with 2 men reported to be critically involved with the behind-the-scenes deal-makers of El Yamama. One, allegedly, was a British defence contractor, Douglas Leese. Leese's son, Julian, denies this. The other was the Saudi businessman, Adnan Khashoggi. Khashoggi was Saudi Arabia's lead arms dealer in the 1970s and 80s, and that helped him build staggering wealth, which in turn funded a headline-grabbing and wildly ostentatious lifestyle. But also investigations into his shady business deals, like being Oliver North's arms broker in the Iran-Contra scandal. Now, both Leese and Khashoggi knew Robert Maxwell, as did Jeffrey, according to several sources. They all 3 met in the early 1980s. Leese's son, Julian, told me that he does not believe that his father knew Maxwell. But according to a very close friend of Khashoggi's, and of Jeffrey's, the Syrian banker Amer Pasha, Maxwell had met Khashoggi through Jeffrey, and they'd become close.
I mean, I don't know how it came about, but it happened on the occasion where he mentioned it was Maxwell that introduced him to Jeffrey. Sometimes even it happened with other people around, but I can't remember who.
Separately, Jeffrey told a business colleague in the 1980s, Stephen Hoffenberg, that Jeffrey was advising Maxwell on his businesses, specifically restructuring debt. Now, Hoffenberg is also a tricky source. He went to prison for 18 years for bilking investors out of almost $500 million in a giant Ponzi scheme. But much of what he's told me over the past 20 years has checked out. I'm going to discuss him in more detail later. He is also a paid consultant for this podcast.
Robert Maxwell was in a financial bind and needed to restructure his debt and obligations with a plan of reorganization. Jeffrey Epstein advised Robert Maxwell on how to reposition his debt, the money he owed, in order to get out of the financial bind he was stuck in at that time. And Jeffrey Epstein was starting to advise Robert Maxwell on his different options of how to reorganize his funding of money around the world.
Maxwell liked Jeffrey, both Ben Menashe and Hoffenberg say. And according to them, in the late 1980s, Maxwell introduced Jeffrey to some of his Israeli network. Now, Ben Menashe claims to have been present for this. But remember, we can't corroborate his account.
I know that Robert Maxwell took him to Israel. Yes, I was there.
So why did Robert Maxwell bring Jeffrey Epstein to Israel to recruit him?
He didn't know what to do with him. He wanted to get him a job. In my view, it's just a guess. I don't have direct knowledge of it. He didn't want him working in his office or with him. He wanted to send him off somewhere else.
Ben Menashe says that the Israelis were divided about whether Jeffrey should be used as some sort of intelligence asset. Personally, he was against it. He couldn't see the point of Jeffrey. He thought he was reckless, dangerous, bad for Israel's reputation.
We just didn't want to have anything to do with him, but Maxwell took him to Israel, and another group of Israeli intelligence people picked him up exactly for the reasons that why we didn't want to have anything to do with him.
In other words, they picked him up because he was a con artist and a thief.
Correct. So please, Jeffrey, I'm sorry for the words, but fuck the dog if he had to.
And there was more. Jeffrey told Steve Hoffenberg that what the Israelis wanted was far more than just off-the-record arms dealing and money laundering. They wanted him to gain access to powerful Americans who could help Israel. They were aware that he might use any means necessary to gain leverage and information, including blackmail. Well, we come back to this allegation then of the influence campaign. They were trying to blackmail politicians, powerful people. Is that what you're talking about?
That's only one component. Blackmail. Influence trading, information trading.
Right.
At the level we're discussing by these three men is very serious and dangerous.
Ben Menashe claims that the pressure to exert an influence campaign in America intensified when Bill Clinton was to become president in 1993. According to Ben Menashe, the Israelis were extremely nervous that the US would turn pro-Palestinian. Victor Ostrovsky says he can't corroborate that, but...
Looking for influence with the American president? Who isn't?
Ostrovsky says that the Israelis often work with civilians to influence powerful people.
There's a name for that today, which is called perception makers.
Perception makers.
Yeah, it's like you have a PR firm.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a PM firm. It's a perception maker, because what you say is, okay, if I tell you the Russians are bad, and I can bring things that made it happen, that, that they're responsible for A, B, C, and D, I can create the perception, whether it's true or not, of something being real.
Sources say that Maxwell was also interested in Jeffrey for something else besides Israel. Here's Amer Pasha. And Adnan told you that Robert Maxwell was really fond of Jeffrey.
Yes.
And Adnan told you that Robert Maxwell wanted his daughter to marry.
Wanted him as the son-in-law.
A source with knowledge told me that Kevin Maxwell looked through every scrap of paper his father had left behind and found no trace of Jeffrey's name. Further, Ghislaine in the 1980s had a boyfriend, a hotel heir, Gianfranco Ciccone, and she was madly in love with him and wanted to marry him. Tom Bauer also told me that there was no trace of Jeffrey in Robert Maxwell's Rolodex. Bauer maintains that they didn't know each other, or at least not well.
Someone like Jeffrey Epstein would have been totally relevant to Robert
Also,
Maxwell.
close friends of Ghislaine's from Oxford don't remember her talking about Jeffrey until around about the time her father died. They're not clear as to how the duo first met. But if Robert Maxwell knew Jeffrey Epstein, it's pretty unlikely that Maxwell would have known about Jeffrey's sexual abuse of minors. Even Jeffrey's former associates say that those were not in evidence back in the 1980s. As far as Jeffrey's friends knew, Jeffrey had many girlfriends. Nonetheless, one girlfriend told one of my sources that Jeffrey never had sex with her. And another woman said that she was invited on holiday with him to pretend to be his girlfriend, but she was not required to actually sleep with him. So there's no doubt that Jeffrey was strange in his sexual habits. But there were also no glaring red flags back then. Biographer Tom Bauer says that despite all his flaws, Robert Maxwell would not have tolerated Jeffrey's sexual abuse of children. So what would Robert Maxwell think of the allegations now being made against his daughter?
I think he'd be utterly appalled and bewildered. There's the dutiful daughter who undoubtedly thought that she had to serve and did serve her father's interests. But there's also the daughter who's clearly reckless and behaving in a way which her father would have disapproved of. I mean, sexually, he had a bad marriage and he had his affairs and his lusts and that, which were usually pretty forlorn. He would have known nothing.
Despite his criminality, Robert Maxwell hoped to be remembered as a force of good in the world. Here's his voice from a BBC interview done only 4 years before his death.
The achievement at the end of it is that I feel that my life, which I'm continuing to live to the full, and will do so until the day I die, I will have left the world a slightly better place by having lived in it and have influenced a few things and people in the right direction, rather as if it hadn't mattered whether I was born, lived, or died.
Maxwell was given a hero's funeral in Jerusalem, where he's buried on the Mount of Olives. But within just days of his death, a shocking crime came to light. Here's Martin Dillon.
Maxwell has stolen the pension funds of the Daily Mirror newspaper. Pension funds of 25,000 people. He was going down, and he was going down in a big way.
Maxwell had stolen hundreds of millions of pounds from his own newspaper's pension fund, and the police knew about it. Viktor Ostrovsky alleges that Maxwell had asked the Mossad for financial help. When they refused, things got ugly. Ostrovsky left the Mossad several years before this happened.
He didn't understand that you do not threaten the Mossad. I mean, you can do a lot of other things, but do not threaten them because they take that very seriously. So when a threat is made, it basically cuts all the history or good history that was there and valuable and whatever, and it's all gone through the window.
So do you think Robert Maxwell was killed by the Mossad?
I think so, yeah.
So that's one possible theory as to why Maxwell may have been murdered. Here's Ari Ben-Menashe.
I believe that Robert Maxwell had to be gotten rid of because he was about to be arrested by the British police, and he would have had to go on trial and go through details that the Israelis and others did not want to be made public.
It wasn't just his narcissism any longer.
Martin Dillon, again.
He was becoming very, very uncontrollable. And I think that Mossad knew that the end had come. And it's not as if Israel hasn't, in the past decided that someone has to go.
Robert Maxwell was dead, but his estate was still on the hook for the missing funds. 2 of his sons, Ian and Kevin, were charged with conspiring to help him. But after a year-long trial, Kevin and Ian were both acquitted. Tom Bauer says that at the start of the trial, he didn't think they had a hope of winning. but their defense was extraordinary.
82 bankers, accountants, and lawyers and fellow directors of the company, and each one of them was rigorously cross-examined and left the witness box demeaned and often discredited.
The Maxwell family was stripped by the British government of all of their material assets. But did Robert Maxwell, with all of his international connections and cunning mindset, squirrel away money offshore? Both Martin Dillon and Tom Bauer think that that is exactly what happened. They say that Robert Maxwell had ensured that there was hidden money.
Robert Maxwell was hiding money for many, many years. He had accounts in places like Liechtenstein.
Yeah, and there's no doubt that some of the money that Robert stole was in the bank accounts, not only in Liechtenstein, but more importantly in the Cayman Islands and the Virgin Islands.
So, in case you missed that, the Maxwell fortune, or some of it, might have survived through these bank accounts. But according to eyewitnesses, Ghislaine appeared at least to be without access to it. It was a drastic U-turn. The heiress, suddenly without money. The daughter, suddenly without her controlling father. Now, many of my sources thought that the Jeffery-Ghislaine relationship was something that grew out of his kindness to her after her father died. But was there more to it?
He was advising Maxwell on the moves with the pension money.
So, it hadn't occurred to me when I first reported on Jeffery that there may have been other reasons that Ghislaine turned to him. That, as Ari Ben-Menashe and Steve Hoffenberg suggest, she went to the man that her father had wanted her to be with. A man who was good at facilitating deals, at hiding money. A man who was friendly with senior Israeli government officials. The so-called Mr. Invisible. Jeffrey Epstein. We left Ghislaine in 1991, when she was grieving her father's death. She moved to New York shortly after that. Here's her friend, Christopher Mason.
She invited me over for a drink at the apartment she was living in after her father died. And it was possibly East 64th Street, I think. It was a white walls, kind of unfurnished, one-bedroom apartment in a sort of a ritzy neighborhood, but pretty bare-bones, simple apartment. And I remember feeling very sorry for her because she spoke constantly about her father's death and she seemed convinced that he had been killed.
But as upset as she was determined to get back on top, fast.
She was talking about this terrible plight and also that she had spoken to people like Henry Kissinger and all these very dazzling names, and they were all expressing their sorrow for Ghislaine's plight, the loss of her father. And she was saying, I just told them, check in with me in a year's time and we'll see what's happening. I mean, she seemed very confident that from this nadir, she was going to be a phoenix pretty shortly. I was really struck by that. And then these reports were coming out in the press about, the financial shenanigans that had been revealed after his death. It seemed like suddenly all the money was gone and her mother and family were sort of not only bereft but from his death, but there was a huge financial impact. Her thing was, great things are going to happen. I don't know what they're going to be, but just check in with me in a year.
I'm Vicky Ward, and this is Chasing Ghislaine. Episode 4, An Unlikely Couple. Whether or not Ghislaine and Jeffrey actually met in 1991, or before that, is a topic that's up for debate. Ghislaine has said in a deposition that 1991 was the year that they met, but my sources could not agree. So much confusion over something that ought to be so simple, right? Here's how Jeffrey himself responded to my question about their relationship in 2002.
Going back to the Ghislaine thing, I mean, the conventional wisdom is that she was very... you can tell me if you don't want to go there.
I'm not shy.
I mean, I don't know when you actually met Ghislaine.
A couple of months before her father died.
And you were dating at that point?
No, I had met her.
Her father died under very strange circumstances, and then the family had to...
Yes.
To suddenly have that massive change of lifestyle. No money, her father is accused of basic robbery. I understand that you would have had a lot of understanding of the finances. You would have been able to sort of talk her through it. Not that she needed it by any stretch.
I knew nothing about it. I never met the father. I stayed totally away from anything to do with... My view is to have respect for my friends and their problems. I simply provided sort of a welcome port for comfort. I think enough people were talking to her about her father.
They were. And people said suddenly that she was on her own and the rest of her family was spread out. Her income had been stripped to much less than what it had been. You gave her a job. You were a friend in everything.
The key word for me is friend. I view that in extremely high regard, so I think friends do things for one another, and that's why I started the earlier thing. I can't limit it to certain things. I take a very broad view of what a friend is, and I think friends have responsibilities.
You can tell, perhaps, from that snippet of conversation, that Jeffrey is distancing himself from Ghislaine, even as he's praising her. Back then, it struck me as a really sad dynamic. Ghislaine wanted to be his girlfriend, but he was pretty adamant that she wasn't. How did it come to this? Understanding Jeffrey's relationship to Ghislaine is central to figuring out what Jeffrey was hiding, namely his appetite for young girls. Whenever they actually met, what is clear is that Robert Maxwell's sudden and strange death was pivotal to Ghislaine's life, and the fact that Jeffrey came to the rescue. At least in her eyes, he did, and that was key. Here's the art dealer Stuart Pavar, who was very close friends with both of them at the time.
When she arrived, she was a terrible wreck, her father having just jumped ship. And Jeffrey sort of put me in charge of her because he was afraid she was so depressed that she wouldn't make it. And so I entertained her with breakfast and lunch for a day or two. She snapped out of it pretty quick. And the two of them made an interesting life together.
Ghislaine had already been working in New York, but Stuart says that Jeffrey encouraged her to stay there. She lived in a little studio apartment off of Madison Avenue. What I didn't know until recently is that Jeffrey had asked Stuart, whom I've known for 20 years, not just to watch her around the clock in case she tried to kill herself, but to accompany her to meetings with lawyers for 3 or 4 days right after her father's death. Stuart was one of Jeffrey's closest friends, and he already knew Ghislaine pretty well. It makes sense, then, that another of Jeffrey's friends, who observed all this firsthand, told me not to think for a second that Jeffrey was motivated out of kindness. No, Jeffrey saw Ghislaine's downfall as an opportunity for himself, according to this person. Jeffrey had a use for Ghislaine. Many uses, actually. Initially, he'd been enthralled by her fame, then her infamy, and finally, her Rolodex. He gave her the authority to run his office, lawyers included, and he was clear in public that she held the position of his lady, his number one woman. Someone who worked for Jeffrey, but didn't want to be identified for fear of professional retribution, reinforced this notion. We've called her Deborah, and have altered her voice. And what sort of evidence did you see that Jeffrey found her to be indispensable? Because if he had all these other young girls, models around, why did he need to keep Ghislaine around?
That was something nobody really
understood, other than we figured there must be some really cosmic, attraction or connection between the two of them. But it went without saying that Ghislaine was number one. And that, she sort of just allowed, these other women were partially because she enjoyed it, but also, it was allowed. But if she wanted or needed something, her word was the word.
And turns out she had a use for him. To get her out of the financial mess that her father had left her in. Now, Steve Hoffenberg, Jeffrey's business partner in the late 1980s, says that Jeffrey had already been advising the Maxwell family financially. But that's not something I've been able to confirm with anybody else. Either way, Jeffrey was beginning to acquire the sort of trappings that Ghislaine had grown up with. In February 1992, he'd rented the former Iranian consul on the Upper East Side in New York. That same year, he'd purchased a vast 33,000 square foot estate in New Mexico that he called Zorro. By the mid-1990s, he'd also have his own plane, as well as the biggest privately owned townhouse in New York City. Nobody I spoke to in 2002, including many Wall Street financiers, could fully understand how Jeffrey had made his money. But the point was that he could provide Ghislaine with the grandeur she was accustomed to, and the influence. And in return, she did what exactly? We know that she managed his properties. She took her friend Christopher to her office one day.
And we went up to, I think it was the second floor where Ghislaine's office was. And this was Jeffrey's office. And she had a large cubicle in a very grand setting. She explained to me that she was working for Jeffrey and her job was running all of his houses. And that she recently got her helicopter license because he'd bought this place in New Mexico. And it was just fantastically useful to him for her to have a helicopter license to ferry him around or ferry friends around. And I just thought, Ghislaine Maxwell just never ceases to kind of astonish. Her conversation is always with talking about these fancy people she knows, and she's with this super rich guy who owns all this extraordinary real estate, and part of the deal is she needs to fly his friends around in a helicopter. It seemed like she took it very seriously, and she was managing all these houses, and they were constantly, there were expansions and acquisitions, and it was a kind of a full-time job for her.
But besides this business relationship, mutual friends told me that Ghislaine soon fell madly, obsessively in love with Jeffrey. Her new lifeline, the stand-in for Daddy. Partly this was because he was rich. But there was something else.
Jeffrey took care of her and she got over it nice, and they made this interesting folie à deux together.
Folie à deux typically means...
folie à deux.
Yes, I know.
People engage in some kind of a scenario with each other, which is of some kind of madness. That's why it's called folie à deux. Right. Two of them invented a mad lifestyle.
So, how mad was this mad lifestyle? There was this other dimension, a strangeness to it all from the get-go. Was the folie à deux so mad that she crossed a line to please her man? That is what this upcoming trial is really about. Because of the truly terrible nature of the allegations against Ghislaine, many people who know her are extremely leery of going on the record for the fear of the damage it would do to their reputations and possibly their livelihoods. So this comes from sources who've asked for anonymity. At first, what people saw in the early 90s was that she was often out by herself. No sign of Jeffrey, and that was odd. Second, she seemed to have an almost manic relationship with the naughty. She talked about sex in all sorts of inappropriate venues, and she behaved scandalously. Journalist Ed Epstein, no relation to Jeffrey, saw this firsthand at a wedding in 1991 at Mar-a-Lago.
She didn't show up during dinner. She showed up for dessert, and, we're finishing dessert. She showed up, and, of course, she needed an excuse, and she said, look, to the whole table, not to me, she announced, she said, I was just having the greatest sex of my life, and I've never had such great sex, so please forgive me, and everyone laughed.
And another former friend told me that he'd seen Ghislaine, mid-dinner party, leap up from the table and push the movie star Hugh Grant to the floor to give him a massage. At the time, it seemed amusing. A bit outrageous, maybe. But her friends told me that they began to wonder whether Ghislaine was overcompensating. Overcompensating for a private suffering that possibly had to do with rejection by Jeffery. So let's think about that. Ghislaine is Jeffrey's general, running his houses and his social life. But did Jeffery ever love her? Or more to the point, did these two even have a romantic relationship? Believe it or not, many people who knew them have actually raised these questions during my reporting. If Jeffery and Ghislaine ever dated exclusively, and that's a big if, it was for a very brief period of time. Sydney Proctor was the nanny for Ghislaine's sister, Christine. Proctor was privy, perhaps, to scenes the rest of us might not have seen. She sent me an email to say that she got a glimpse of just how unhappy Jeffery had made Ghislaine. Sydney wrote to me that she remembered that Ghislaine had come to visit her sister in the early 1990s. To Sydney, it was quite obvious that Ghislaine's romantic relationship with Jeffery was already over. Sydney has given me permission to quote her email. She wrote as follows.
Ghislaine and Christine were not close at all. Therefore, when Ghislaine showed up to the Oakland Hills home of her sister to lick her wounds after the breakup, it was rather unexpected. She was in our house maybe 28 hours. She was much thinner than she had been in August of 1991, almost amorphous. No discernible female curves like boobs or hips left. She wore black leggings, an oversized gray cashmere sweater, and black boots. She spent the majority of her visits staring at a jigsaw puzzle she started on our dining room table. We had little kids, and her puzzle was 2,000 pieces, so she must have brought it with her, as it wasn't something we had in the house. When Ghislaine departed, Christine said she had been there because she was feeling sorry for herself after her breakup with that, quote, arse, Jeffery. Christine was livid on behalf of her sister because, to add insult to injury, Jeffery, quote, made Ghislaine find his, quote, girlfriends.
Proctor explained to me that at the time, both she and Christine assumed that the girlfriends were in their 20s, not underage. So whether it was romantic or not, the Jeffery-Ghislaine relationship was definitely very weird, according to my sources, completely uneven. As early as January 1993, we know that Jeffery didn't even invite Ghislaine to his 40th birthday party, an all-male affair for 6 people. Yet she organized the entire thing down to the smallest and strangest detail.
They'd have a chef from a fancy restaurant had been hired to produce an extraordinary dinner for these 6 or 7 guys. And it was the upstairs, downstairs kind of thing going on. And Ghislaine was there, very excited, very kind of charged, because it was all going so well, and they had loved the incredibly elaborate dinner that had been made.
Christopher Mason was asked by Ghislaine to perform a lewd song.
I used to do these sort of musical roasts and musical toasts. So when I do these songs, I usually try and speak to as many people as possible to get as much comic information and from as many diverse voices as possible to maximize the comedy potential of the song. But Ghislaine was very, very specific that I could only speak to her. I could not speak to anyone else. And it seemed to be this odd thing that she was still under this incredible pressure to try and please and delight and surprise him. And there were certain specific things that she wanted to have included in the song. One of them was that Ghislaine claims he has 24-hour erections. which was possibly hyperbolic.
Yes.
And she thought that would, if you'll excuse the expression, get a great rise out of him. Also, she wanted me to put into the song that he had taught at Dalton and that he was the subject of many schoolgirl crushes. These were the things that she was very insistent had to be in the song. So it was, it was making clear that they were lovers, and she knew that he had these, 24-hour erections. And Ghislaine was very specific again about how I should deliver the song. So she gave me Jeffrey's karate outfit. I think he was studying for his black belt at the time. So she wanted me to put on his karate outfit and knock on the door of this upstairs drawing room, announce myself, sit cross-legged in the middle of the room, and sing this song to these 6 powerful guys in black tie. And it was after dinner, and they were, smoking cigars and drinking brandy. There was much sniggering going on and all-out laughter from this small group of extraordinarily powerful and impressive guys. The atmosphere was like a kind of old boys club.
Christopher only remembers 3 of the men who were there. The billionaire businessman Les Wexner, the musician Itzhak Perlman, and the dean of Harvard at the time, Henry Rosofsky.
So it was unbelievably strange.
I mean, the other thing that seems pathetic, in the true sense of the word, is that Ghislaine wasn't at this dinner.
No. She was the enabler and the gal Friday. And it was just all male boys club, powerful guys.
And did Ghislaine watch you perform the song?
No. It was just me sitting cross-legged in the karate outfit with these guys. But as soon as I came down, she was desperate for details of how it had gone and how they reacted. And she was very much stage managing the whole thing.
It's a revealing vignette, isn't it? Ghislaine in the kitchen. Ghislaine, the behind-the-scenes organizer. And yet Ghislaine wasn't invited to the actual party. And that wasn't the only strange incident that Christopher heard about.
So this friend told me that the strangest thing had happened. She'd been having this meeting with Ghislaine, and her cell phone rang. And it was Jeffery. And she said, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I've got to go. It's Jeffery. He has a cold, and he wants me to find the best chicken soup in New York City. Oh my God, what am I? Oh my God, it has to be the best chicken soup." And this seemed deeply odd to my friend, that this whim had struck Jeffery, and Ghislaine was frantic to please him. It seemed to have jibed with what we had been hearing about her father to this point, that he was monstrous, but a famous monster, and famously difficult and underhanded and a kind of dirty, dealing, swashbuckling rogue, and that Ghislaine had been at great pains to try and please her father. And it seemed that intense desire, need to please, had transferred from her relationship with her father to Jeffery.
You'd think Jeffery would have been grateful for such devotion. But no. Just like Ghislaine's dad, he was at best disrespectful, often in public, say multiple sources.
I ran into them at an art opening at the Jewish Museum. Ghislaine greeted me and gave me a hug and said, "It's Jeffery." Yeah. And it was like she was so excited that I was going to get to meet the great Jeffery who she was dating, and that I had to know that he was a really big deal, and that she was kind of putting her reputation on the line by introducing someone to him. I remember being struck that he was wearing faded blue jeans and a sweatshirt. And this was a fancy Upper East Side art opening. And it just seemed like he was, it was kind of inappropriate dress for a kind of ritzy art opening. And I just remember meeting him and noticing this kind of what appeared to be a permanent smirk on his face. And it seemed to convey the idea that I am so rich and so powerful and, I don't need to dress up.
Was he interested to meet you, a friend of Ghislaine's?
I felt like I was being judged. Like, so who are you?
Right.
Why should I care? And that talking to me was something he was doing as a kind of, dispensation to Ghislaine, that she has all these friends that he has to meet. He didn't seem very interested in me at all, which is fine with me. I didn't care.
Another person told me that Jeffery was tough on Ghislaine from the start and unfaithful. One Sunday, she was working in his office with an associate. They were looking at paperwork for Jeffery. But then Jeffery bounces in with a gorgeous model on his arm. The associate, seeing the pain on Ghislaine's face, says that afterwards he hugged her and told her, quote, "You don't have to do this." But she replied by saying that her father had taught her that you do whatever it takes to keep your man. So when Jeffery told her to lose weight and quit smoking, she did exactly what he said. In 2002, Jeffery had told me that it was a matter of pride for him that Ghislaine had followed his instructions on this.
My association with drugs and drink is only negative.
Is that why Ghislaine doesn't drink?
She did before she met me, because I helped most of the people around me.
Remember, these conversations between Jeffery and me are recreated by actors because the tapes were lost. So Ghislaine's friends said that they were worried from the outset that Jeffery treated her abusively, quite obviously. One person recalled bumping into her and asking how she was. Ghislaine responded that she never knew her schedule because she didn't know who Jeffery was taking to Palm Beach for that weekend. It could be her or another woman. Unsurprisingly, Ed and the rest of her friends began to despise Jeffery. They wished she would dump him.
Jeffery was always seen, as I saw him, as a sort of a sleazy operator. I don't think any of her friends ever liked Jeffery or even wanted him to attend anything with her. So it was a sort of strange relationship.
He went on to say that he and some of her friends believed that, quote, kinky things, including ménage à trois, were going on because of Jeffery.
She was sort of desperate to keep in favor with Jeffery, to please Jeffery.
The idea of an independent, sophisticated woman behaving like this is, of course, puzzling. But think back to what her dad had told her. Do whatever it takes to keep your man. At least, that's what Ghislaine had said to my source that her father had taught her. But was she really willing to do whatever it took to make Jeffery happy? That's the question that the jury will have to answer when they hear the criminal case against Ghislaine, and, of course, her defense. When I was reporting on Jeffery for Vanity Fair, I remember that one woman, then in her 20s, had visited Jeffery's island at his invitation. Now she told me that by far the most disturbing thing she had witnessed was not all the adult women who were gushing about Jeffery and treating him like some sort of god. No, it was the imbalance in his relationship with Ghislaine. Ghislaine had fussed after him while he just dismissed her. But there was a transactionality to the relationship that perhaps for Ghislaine overrode everything else. Jeffery had money, and therefore power and status, which he transferred to her. Sydney Proctor, the nanny for Ghislaine's sister, told me that she'd heard that Ghislaine was able to drive through New York City with police lights in her car. And what did Ghislaine provide Jeffery? Well, she had a Rolodex of rich and powerful people. She taught him which salad fork to use, one person explained to me. My source explained that despite his growing wealth, Jeffery was socially clueless, bordering on crass, and that he was aware of this deficiency, and he left it up to Ghislaine to fix him. This was something that Ewan Relly, who's another member of the British expat group in New York, also noticed.
There was this very strong contrast. Ghislaine was absolutely charming, and Jeffrey Epstein was absolutely charmless.
Ghislaine taught Jeffery how to aim even higher socially, which of course would help his quote-unquote business. She taught him how to talk to his staff, how to manage them. By himself, for example, he would never have known what to wear to the races at Royal Ascot in England, where the couple were photographed with Prince Andrew in June of 2000. She did all this with a certain theatricality, according to a friend. She made it fun. Ghislaine was also unusual for Jeffery because she didn't need to be molded by him. She didn't need an education or introductions. The other women in his life typically did. He liked to play the guru, and he found it hard to let go of his protégés. This became a big problem for Ghislaine, or at least that's how it was perceived by their friends. One of his protégés in particular.
Ava was a runner-up in Miss Universe.
Oh, was she?
Yes,
All right. But with a brain.
very much so.
And she's a doctor, correct?
Yes, great doctor.
Before Ghislaine, there was Eva Andersson, a former Miss Sweden. Ava had been with Jeffery off and on for 10 years. But Jeffery broke it off, not, he said, because he didn't love her. In fact, his friends said that as far as Jeffery was capable of loving anybody, he did love Ava. But he told his friends that he hated kids. At the time, there was no irony about this, apparently. He really couldn't stand the idea of having any. But he and Ava stayed very, very close, even after she married somebody that Jeffery introduced her to, a hedge fund manager called Glenn Dubin. Their eldest daughter, Selena, would become Jeffrey's goddaughter. And he told me that Selena was by far the most important person in his world. Two of Jeffrey's former best friends told me that every time Ava walked into the room when they were there, even after Jeffery and Ava had broken up, Jeffery made it quite clear that Ava was his priority, not Ghislaine. They said it was embarrassing. I asked Jeffery this back in 2002 when I was sitting in his house.
Well, I suppose one thing that you can tell me this is why someone did say to me that, there's lots of pictures of Ava Dubin around the house. And what does Ghislaine feel about that sort of thing?
There are lots of pictures of lots of people around the house.
There were lots of pictures of lots of people, but I didn't see a single one of Ghislaine. And interestingly, Jeffery held Ava up to his future protégés as the role model that they should aspire to be, not Ghislaine.
Some people aren't lucky enough to have parents who support them in whatever they want to do. I've been lucky enough to be able to help somebody get an education like Ava, and her life changed.
I remember him saying this. I didn't really believe that he didn't have an ulterior motive. What's interesting to me about the examples of Ava and Ghislaine, side by side, is that it really shows what Jeffery looked for in his relationships with women. Dependency. It's almost like he could treat Ava better and revere her because he'd paid for her medical school. He'd given her an education. But Ghislaine? Well, he had to manufacture that dependency by withholding. Kira Diktia is another woman who has insight into all of this. She's a successful Russian model who says that she was mentored by Jeffery for the last 15 years of his life. Jeffery lent Kira his Paris apartment, his chef, and his driver. He offered to pay for her education, and he gave her tips on how to advance her modeling career.
Did he ever introduce you to Ava Andersson?
Once he was almost introduced me because she's a doctor.
Yes.
And I needed to see a doctor, so he almost introduced me to...
Yes. And he also said that he held Ava Dubin up as a role model as somebody who came here as a very successful model. She was a former Miss Sweden.
Miss Sweden.
Who then ended
and he
up...
turned her life. He was willing to pay for my education, and I should have taken the advice and go study while he was alive. Now, but I was not ready. I was too young. I was very ambitious about modeling career, so I didn't want it to go study something.
Kira says that by contrast, he only once mentioned Ghislaine.
And did he ever talk about Ghislaine?
Well, he was saying that she's his best friend.
To you?
Yes, and she's flying helicopters.
But other than that was a long time ago.
Yeah.
So in the last 10 years...
No, we didn't discuss it. We had many other things to discuss.
Kira says that Jeffrey compartmentalized women. There were women from whom to get massages, women to use as bait for business. She told me about when she'd had an appointment with Jeffrey and brought along her friend, also a model.
Gorgeous blonde model. We went there, we chit-chat a little bit, we get some presents from Jeffrey. Jeffrey gave us presents back. And he asked for a favor to just sit down in his hallway, this is a beautiful house, just to sit down and sit like for half an hour. Because Emir of Qatar or...
The Emir of
Qatar or maybe some other country it was like a few people who was coming in and out of his office, and they all was looking at us.
And he paid you for that, right? I mean,
it was not really paid for that. We both get $1,000 anyway.
I mean, this is this extraordinary thing. So, in contrast to obviously the women who've come forward in the last year, you would go, and women who were similarly successful and famous models,
yes,
get paid a lot more money. When you were never asked to massage
no,
him.
never.
But what he did want you to do was meet his rich and famous clients.
Yes, and one of my girlfriends met one of the clients.
Kira says that Jeffrey had some of her friends attend Jeffrey's business meetings, wearing no bras under their t-shirts. He said this gave him an advantage.
Because he wanted to have a partner distracted.
So he wanted the person he was doing business with to be distracted by a woman.
So it's hard to imagine Ghislaine in this world. She wasn't a model. She didn't need to be educated. But now, we've learned exactly where she fit in. Ed Epstein tells me he remembers something very strange that happened at a dinner he attended in New York in the 1990s. Ghislaine was sitting next to him at his table in a restaurant.
At a certain point during dinner, she got up from the table and she walked to another table, 3-4 tables away. And there was a very attractive, blonde girl who I later learned was a model from Denmark. And she struck up a conversation with her. And, again, I turned to someone else at the table and said, "What's she doing? Does she know?" No, she's trying to recruit that girl to go on with them to Palm Beach because Jeffrey likes models or something like that. And then I later found out that she succeeded and that girl did go to Palm Beach with them.
So Ed's story is not that surprising to us now. But in 2002, while I was talking to Jeffrey, I hadn't got any idea that this sort of thing was going on. I did ask him about Ghislaine, and it was clear that he didn't want to talk about her at all. Listen to how Jeffrey attempts to throw me off track, but then slips up at the end in a way that was extremely rare for how smooth and manipulative he usually was.
In terms of the Ghislaine stuff, and you should help me, I wouldn't answer my questions to my mother regarding Ghislaine because I find somewhat...
But you would rather talk about... I understand that.
Yeah, I think the concept of... there's a great picture of Ghislaine, by the way. You might want to think about... she was recently flying a Black Hawk helicopter. She was the only girl ever to fly one.
Well, I know that she does all these amazing things, but where was that picture?
She has it, I think. But I'll talk to her. That's just... it's an amazing shot because no other girl has ever flown one. She's my best friend.
Right. Well, that is what I thought.
And she has been for a very long time.
Right. I mean, the picture that I have is of, people who are very, very mutually dependent on each other. And so to sort of say, I mean, it's just the impression that this piece gave me was slightly misleading.
Mutually dependent has sort of a syrupy connotation.
When you have set up dinners for the scientists at your house, she's the one organizing it.
That's correct.
She's involved in buying art sometimes. Or, she gets very involved in a lot of the administration. And that, people have said, not just in that, you both...
She doesn't find girls for me, by the way.
I didn't ask you that.
When he told me that she didn't find girls for him, believe it or not, back then I thought he was joking. The idea of Ghislaine waiting outside a private school, or any school, to scout for young girls in an afternoon would have been just preposterously unlikely. I pictured her shopping on Madison Avenue or flying around the world with billionaires. Even now, when I've put it to people who went to dinner with her regularly, they're astonished. Sure, in 2002, female friends of hers told me that in their 20s, they'd gone to tea with Ghislaine, and that other young women had been present, and that eventually Jeffery had shown up. They said they'd begun to feel a bit uncomfortable. But no one said why. No one said any more than that. It seems that Ghislaine's friends are only now starting to put the pieces together. I knew Christopher Mason very well back in 2002, but I never knew until now what you're about to hear.
The first time I was aware of Jeffery was when Ghislaine invited me to a party that she was throwing for her mother, the widow, Betty Maxwell, in the townhouse that Jeffrey Epstein, I presume he owned it, but it turned out later that he was renting that one. And it was quite opulent. It became clear that Ghislaine had invited all of her closest friends at the time, which at the time included me, to meet her, beloved mother. And I don't have any recollection of Jeffrey being there at that party, but this was very much his townhouse, and Ghislaine seemed to be very much at home there. And it seemed, yes, indeed, as she had predicted a year before, just, check in with me in a year's time. And here was, a sort of socially elite, power elite, smart, attractive, cool friends. And she was playing hostess for her mother in Jeffrey Epstein's house. The thing that I remember most about that party was this rumor going around the room that Ghislaine was dating Jeffrey, but bizarrely, he preferred younger girls. And she was finding girls for him. And that she had been loitering around Spence School, the very kind of elite school for girls on the Upper East Side, finding girls for Jeffrey. And at the time, it seemed deeply weird. If this was the guy that she was dating, why would the hell she be finding younger girls for him? But I have to say, at the time, it seemed it was the gossip going around at that party.
So this is very early on in their relationship.
Very.
This is 1992 or thereabouts.
It is, absolutely. It's like the spring of 1992. So the first thing I knew about Ghislaine dating Jeffrey was that, yes, they were dating, but he really enjoyed the company of girls. Curiously, at the time, it seemed like I can't believe talking about it in this way now, but at the time, it seemed relatively innocent, as if he was flirting with these girls and taking them to tea and enjoyed their company. There was no sense of anything depraved. I mean, my impression was that these were sort of seniors, high school seniors, and that he enjoyed hanging out with them. It sounds ridiculous to say now.
But this was gossip at the party, but nobody actually talked to Ghislaine directly about it.
No, but I was hearing it from very close friends of Ghislaine who would have known.
So, when I put Maria and Annie Farmer into this context, their allegations make so much more sense now. What also makes sense now is that the abuse that Jeffery visited on underage girls couldn't have happened without lots and lots of money. Money that wooed Ghislaine into his web in the first place. What I've discovered is that Jeffery used the same manipulation in his relationships with women as he did in his financial relationships with men. But what remains is the question that I originally went after. Where did all his money come from? That's next time on Chasing Ghislaine.
Heads up, there's some graphic sexual imagery in this episode. It may not be suitable for all listeners.
As a reminder of where this whole reporting journey started for me, it was 2002, and I had the supposedly simple assignment of digging into how Jeffrey Epstein got rich. The sexual abuse, Ghislaine, her father, and her relationship to Jeffrey, none of that was on my radar back then. Jeffrey only really had one thing that he didn't keep secret. A single billionaire client, Leslie, or Les, Wexner.
You probably haven't heard of Les Wexner, the founder and CEO of L Brands, which owns Victoria's Secret. But he started the company in 1963, and he is one of the best retail CEOs in the business.
Mr. Wexner is one of America's really great businessmen. He's the wealthiest man in Ohio. He founded this company with $5,000 from his aunt and built it into a $5 billion, just enormous success story.
From the outside, Les Wexner is a reserved, straight-laced, no-nonsense businessman. Inexplicably, he and Jeffrey were very, very close. Wexner had even taken the extraordinary step of giving Jeffrey power of attorney over pretty much everything. Jeffrey had even given Vanity Fair's then editor Graydon Carter a picture of Les and his wife to publish in a profile that was supposed to be about Jeffrey.
In terms of the photograph, if you want to use the photograph I gave Graydon with Les and his wife, did you get anything from Les?
I literally just got back to my office. I've just had an email from him. I haven't even had a chance to read it. So we're going to need to put that in. So you will hear from me on Monday.
Remember, these conversations are recreated by actors because the original tapes were lost. So this relationship between Wexner and Jeffrey just didn't make sense, not to me or anybody else. As far as we all knew, Jeffrey had dropped out of college, and his resume just wasn't that impressive. So how did he get so close to somebody like Les Wexner? Getting into Jeffrey's history will answer some of that. It'll also show how Jeffrey got to cozy up to so many rich and powerful people, including Ghislaine. I'm Vicky Ward. This is episode 5. Find the Dupe. In this episode, you're going to hear 3 big discoveries that I've made about Jeffrey's money and how he got it. They're patterns that he started forming pretty early in his career, some of them long before I met him in 2002. Now, my reporting for Vanity Fair only exposed him for what he wasn't. But I didn't answer the fundamental question. What was he? And where did his money come from? Discovery number 1. What really happened at Bear Stearns. Jeffrey's financial career got its start in a back office of Bear Stearns on Wall Street. Bear Stearns was a global investment bank, and Jeffrey had started working there in the 1970s. But after only 5 years, Jeffrey suddenly left. Why? Now, ironically, what seems like it should have been a black mark on Jeffrey's record would turn out to be critical to his success over the next 2 decades. So taking you back to 2002, while Les Wexner was on the top of my list, I put Jeffrey's association with Bear Stearns as my next line of inquiry. Jeffrey wanted me to talk to Jimmy Kane about why he had left.
I think you might want to talk to Jimmy. My sense of remembering is Jimmy really wanted me to stay.
But what was weird was that before I'd even phoned Jimmy Kane, he phoned me. He summoned me in to see him. Remember, at this time, he was the CEO of the board of Bear Stearns. I spent a whole afternoon with him. He talked for so long that I remember that my pregnant body felt really uncomfortable at having to sit still for that amount of time. It was clear that Jimmy Kane was on a major charm offensive. He talked on and on about a wide range of subjects, about how much he hated lawyers, his love of bridge. He took me on a tour of the bank's new headquarters. Wait, didn't he have a bank to run? Kane praised Jeffrey up and down, saying he'd been really sorry to see him leave the bank. He added that Jeffrey was now a major client. But he was cagey as to why Jeffrey had left back in 1981. That year, Bear Stearns' senior executives were being investigated by the SEC for illegal trading. Now, in the midst of that investigation, Jeffrey, then the most junior partner, had abruptly left the firm after copping to wrongdoing, according to his own deposition. Now, Kane told me that he had tried to persuade Jeffrey to stay. But in fact, according to a source who witnessed this, Jeffrey was so upset when asked to leave, he cried. He claimed that he was being scapegoated, but having done what was asked of him, he had loyalty at Bear Stearns until the bank's ultimate collapse in the financial crisis of 2008. Ace Greenberg, the former chairman of Bear Stearns, told me in 2002, quote, "He's a dear friend of many of us here. He's a business associate of ours. And in many respects, his word is his bond. And he's just, in my opinion, a first-class guy. And I'm going to go on record with that." End quote. Well, here's Jeffrey's future partner, Steve Hoffenberg, about whom you'll hear a lot more in the next episode.
Jeffrey Epstein could have substantially damaged Bear Stearns. He had that information.
But did he feel that he was asked to take the fall for other people?
He was asked to explain what they wanted explained by him.
I see.
He followed the party line. He was given the party line, and he did exactly what they told him.
You'll note Hoffenberg's language is pretty cryptic. Even when I pushed him, he never spelled out precisely what he meant or who Jeffrey was supposed to be protecting. And remember, who knows if Jeffrey even told Hoffenberg the truth? Hoffenberg would become one more gullible target for Jeffrey, as you're going to hear later. So, how did Jeffrey even get this position at Bear Stearns in the first place? One of Jeffrey's first adult jobs was as a math teacher at a fancy New York private school. The Dalton School's annual tuition is currently more than $55,000 a year. So you can imagine the wealth of the parents who send their kids there. One of those parents was Ace Greenberg, who, as I've mentioned, was then the chairman of Bear Stearns. Jeffrey was tutoring one of Greenberg's children. And then Greenberg hired Jeffrey. So Jeffrey told me that the fact that there was no conventional training program at Bear Stearns was something that helped him. It helped him to thrive there. And unconventional is exactly how one could describe Jeffrey's work for Bear Stearns. To give you some context, Jeffrey was coming up at a time of sea change in the financial industry. It used to be that when wealthy people wanted to invest their money, they were most concerned about who ran the company. But Jeffrey told me that in the 70s, the industry became less concerned with who the men in charge were. And of course it was all men, and more worried about what the numbers were saying.
And Greenberg was very prescient to decide that Wall Street would become very numbers-oriented as opposed to people-oriented. So the ability for people with facility or agility with numbers
was obviously good.
Yes, most people on Wall Street didn't need to know how to add.
Enter Jeffrey Epstein, who did know how to add. I mean, he was a math teacher when Greenberg first met him. But he didn't yet have any experience in the finance world. So Jeffrey figured out a rather unorthodox way to get himself up to speed.
I had read an article about Saul Steinberg, and it said that he never really went to universities. All he did was read annual reports to learn business, and I couldn't believe it. It was in Forbes, or one of those magazines in '76, I think. What I did was I sat on the beach on Palm Beach probably every weekend for 3 months, bringing down every book I could read on finance, including the tax codes.
Did you own your own house in Palm Beach then, or rent a house?
No, I rented a house in Palm Beach then. I would sit on the beach and I would read until... because back then I only understood learning by reading books.
And what were you reading?
I would read all the rules about option trading, for example, or commodity trading. Again, it was all because it was expressed in terms of numbers, so it was like reading another math book for me. And what I would try to do is there is a word called arbitrage.
Broadly, arbitrage means that you make money from the price differential between markets. Jeffrey gave me this example.
It was first described to me as someone who was in the arbitrage business, woke up in the morning and he turned on his radio and heard that in New York it was 60 degrees and in London it was 72. So he said, okay, buy New York and sell London.
So this isn't rocket science. Nonetheless, it's interesting to hear how Jeffrey was thinking about finance right from the start. This would turn out to be his original foothold into an entire world of power and wealth. Jeffrey's speciality was finding ways to minimize taxes for the bank's wealthiest individual clients. But Jeffrey didn't look at the tax code for solutions. He looked for discrepancies in numbers.
So then you realize that there is an inefficiency in these markets, allowing, where Jimmy talks about loopholes, it is not really a loophole, it's the concept of just being able to buy and sell something in different places, but taking up the difference because of different types of movement by currencies.
I discovered from my recent reporting that some wealthy New Yorkers who knew Jeffrey did think that his ideas about currency trading were audacious and risky, but brilliant. For example, he suggested to one individual that they could borrow $1 billion in Japanese yen when the yen was overvalued, put that money into bonds, and then convert back to yen upon selling, by which time the yen would have depreciated and the person could potentially make $250 million. Now, this isn't the kind of advice individuals were getting from their regular money managers, who tend to be far more conservative. So Jeffrey's ideas developed a bit of a following among the uber-rich.
Now, when you were doing all this, when you were looking at these markets, you're not doing this for yourself. You're doing this for clients of Bear Stearns.
That is correct.
And would these on the whole be private individuals? I mean, is this where the whole term started?
It was private individuals.
It was private individuals. Net worth, right?
Yes, very.
Jeffrey explained to me that in the 1970s, very wealthy individuals might have to pay as much as 70% on their dividends from investments.
You're kidding me. I had no idea.
Yes.
I mean, knowingly you would pay that much tax?
Yes, that was the tax rate then on certain types of income.
On a high net worth income?
Correct. But in the same category, if someone had sold their company, they would only pay 35 or 40%.
Okay, so it made sense to put money in companies.
That is correct. So you see a difference in tax rate. In one case, it would have been 70, and in one case, which was very similar, it would have been 40.
So if Jeffrey's clients had followed his advice in this example, they would have saved 30% in taxes. No wonder they thought he was brilliant. But even in all of the hours I was on the phone with Jeffrey, he never mentioned to me the rather critical fact that his leaving Bear Stearns was messy, to put it mildly. He insisted that he had simply resigned. And this was supported by Jimmy Kane and Ace Greenberg. But I knew that he'd left in peculiar circumstances. Eventually, I'd found 2 depositions that he gave in which he talked about his exit and also losing his broker's license. The first deposition was to the Securities and Exchange Commission, or SEC, and it was given in 1981. Jeffrey claimed that he had loaned his, quote, closest friend a significant sum of money to buy newly issued stock. The executives told him that this was a potentially serious offense. The SEC pushed him to say what he knew about other senior executives' trading activity, especially that of the then CEO, Jimmy Kane. Jeffrey said he knew nothing. What I want to point out here is that Jeffrey resigned from Bear Stearns just days before this deposition. Yet the bank's lawyers were still representing him, and he'd been given a bonus for the year. Something was fishy. I knew all this at the time I was interviewing Jeffrey in 2002, but I didn't let him know, not at first anyway. I wanted to see what he would say when I asked him about Bear Stearns.
I didn't want to stay because I couldn't. This is off the record. I don't deal well with people who have narrow-mindedness.
Just to note that we're making the judgment that it is in the public interest to hear Jeffrey's verbatim comments on the record.
So Jimmy had made an effort to have me stay, or trying to encourage me to stay, different types of encouragements. I am not sure if he had somebody who was saying, we prefer him not to stay because he's a little crazy, but nothing to do with me. I never had a run-in with anybody except people trying to say, you are a partner here. I think I was the youngest partner ever there, and I said I can't do it.
But I kept pushing back. Eventually, I told him that I had some idea that he had loaned money to a friend to buy stock. Now, just so you understand, it wasn't nearly as simple as that. The potentially serious offense here is insider trading. So Jeffrey would lend money to a friend to buy a stock that he knew was about to go public, and therefore it would skyrocket in value. That sort of stock is nicknamed a hot issue on Wall Street. So the idea was that Jeffrey would sell the hot issue to his friend, and that friend would eventually pay back both the profit the stock had earned to Jeffrey, plus the original loan. I had heard the name of one of Jeffrey's friends from multiple Bear Stearns senior executives. It was not the name that Jeffrey had given in his deposition, which was male. The name I heard was the name of Jeffrey's then-girlfriend, whose name we've removed from the transcript.
We come to something that is serious, which is the allegation that at Bear Stearns, you were told to stop giving hot issues to after she had left.
Right.
And that you had continued to do it, and the executive committee met and voted you 5-2 that you had to go.
Not true.
Not true? None of it?
No.
Okay.
No.
Okay.
But what? How would... So you understand sort of obviously some of my concerns on these things?
Mm-hmm.
Where would you get something so crazy?
Well, I can't. I'm not at liberty to tell you that.
Right. The 2 people who were on the executive committee at that time were Jimmy and Ace.
I'm aware of that.
And I'm sure that they would tell you that that's not what happened.
Well, I will have to call them.
You should.
But I called you first.
You already spoke to Jimmy about this.
I did, but I didn't. At the time I hadn't. I was beginning the piece, so I hadn't had these things to put to him. So obviously, of course, we will be putting them to him. But I just, as a matter of courtesy, come to you first.
Now, in 2002, Kane and Greenberg backed Jeffrey's version of events. Greenberg told me, I have no recollection of any of that whatsoever. And Kane said that any allegation that Jeffrey had been forced out was, quote, bullshit. More recently, Kane did not return calls for comment. Greenberg passed away in 2014. And in 2002, I'd also managed to speak with Jeffrey's former girlfriend, and she denied that anything untoward had happened, and she hasn't been implicated in anything criminal. But she also told me that after Jeffrey had left Bear Stearns in 1981, the 2 of them went to spend quite a bit of time in England. She said they had been, quote, thrust into a very high level of politicians and international industrialists. She said that Jeffery had become immersed in this world. She added a bit mysteriously that it was a complex time and that there were not as many rules or scrutiny as there are now. Now, at the time, I didn't get what she was talking about at all. And I didn't think it important, frankly. How wrong I was. So this is the second big discovery. How a key mentor showed Jeffery how to make big money in black markets. Now, I understand what Jeffery was up to in England after being forced out of Bear Stearns. This is when things, well, started to go dark, or more accurately, perhaps, invisible. It's the point at which Jeffery levels up, in a way. He starts making the connections that are going eventually to give him tremendous power and wealth. And it all centers on this man, Douglas Leese. Leese was a very secretive, complex character. In simplest terms, he was a British defence contractor. It's telling that in my conversations with Jeffery, he denied knowing Douglas Leese.
Douglas Leese, I think he was the father of somebody I knew. I think his son was friendly with Ferranti. That's where that whole crowd comes in that you asked me about a long time ago. I think his name was Nicholas. It was sort of that 66th Street building. I think they might have all lived there.
But the connection between Jeffery and Leese is undeniable. Even one of Leese's sons, Julian, has acknowledged the relationship between his late father and Jeffery. I spoke to Julian on the phone, and he was shocked when I read him what Jeffery had said about not knowing his father. He wanted to let an interview he'd done for the Defiance podcast in the UK speak for him now.
I think that Jeffery very much looked at my father as a mentor. I think my father recognized that Jeffery had come, let's say, from a less privileged background and wanted to, really in a way, to try and encourage Jeffery to get more involved in business and to experience more in life.
And Leese definitely did introduce Jeffery to new experiences. I recently discovered that Leese and Jeffery met in England in the early 1980s. The impeccably dressed Leese, who lived part-time on a vast estate in the British countryside, had introduced Jeffery to tailored suits and shooting and the world of the British upper classes, as well as international moguls and financiers. Leese also allegedly hired Jeffery to be a middleman in invisible deals. According to two sources who spent time with both of them, Leese helped train Jeffery to move money all around the world. Now his son Julian says that his father was not an arms dealer. He was a defense contractor.
Douglas Leese was a mastermind at selling armaments, and he sold, marketed many types of armament, many types of equipment, airplanes, other military equipment, continuously throughout his career.
According to his business partner, Steve Hoffenberg, whom you've heard from before, and two other sources, Douglas Leese also introduced Jeffery to all sorts of people in the arms business, including Turkish-born Saudi businessman Adnan Khashoggi, probably the most famous international arms dealer of the last century, and the central figure in the El Yamamah arms deal. Now, Julian Leese, Douglas's son, told me that this is categorically not true. Julian says that his father was not involved in El Yamamah, although Douglas's name is mentioned in the British parliamentary record concerning the arms deal. But here's what bothered me. What would somebody like Douglas Leese have possibly seen in Jeffrey Epstein, the Bear Stearns dropout? Julian Leese says it's quite simple, that Jeffrey was charming, very clever, and hell-bent on meeting people. And his father knew a lot of important people all over the world. Steve Hoffenberg was one of those. Hoffenberg employed Leese's son Julian, and later Lease himself consulted for him. Hoffenberg was the founder of Towers Financial Corporation, a US debt collection and reinsurance company. In 1987, Hoffenberg says that he hired Jeffery as a consultant at Lease's recommendation. At least, that's according to Hoffenberg. In a phone interview, Julian Lease told me that it was the other way round. Jeffery introduced the Leases to Hoffenberg.
Douglas Lease saw in Jeffrey Epstein a Wall Street expert, a capital markets securities expert, and felt that Jeffrey Epstein could design and execute marketing, which was a big issue to Sir Douglas Lease.
I asked Hoffenberg to explain this, because, after all, how do you do marketing for a defense contractor?
He expanded his abilities around the world to countries throughout the Middle East and other areas of the world where he was able to sell, to market a lot for the Douglas Lease opportunities to many countries, people, arms dealers, companies, many.
Put simply, Jeffrey's job was to seek out people who wanted to operate in a dark market. Now, as I mentioned in an earlier episode, Steve Hoffenberg later went to prison for 18 years for bilking investors out of almost $500 million in a giant Ponzi scheme. So that's why he's a tricky source. But at this point, he's known Jeffrey a long time. He's also a paid consultant for this podcast. So it's somewhat telling that even Hoffenberg says he balked when asked to join in what he describes as a, quote, national security scheme that wasn't limited to just arms dealing.
I was deeply aware of what Sir Douglas Lease did, what Adnan Khashoggi did in the national security issues, and I rejected and walked away from that.
You mean you knew they were arms dealers and
Yes.
worked for governments and,
yes.
and you didn't want any part of
I
that?
didn't want any part of that.
So what exactly were Jeffrey and Lease's ultimate goals? I've mentioned in a previous episode about Robert Maxwell and his alleged connection to arms dealing in the Middle East. But I recently discovered that Lease and Jeffery also thought about possibilities in the United States. Listen to this story, which goes up to the highest levels of the American military. A source who's requested anonymity because of the sensitivity of what was discussed told me that Jeffery invited this source to join him and Lease on a private jet trip to the Pentagon in the early 1980s. They were there for a meeting with General Kelly Burke, who was then retiring from the Air Force. According to my source, Lease attempted to recruit the general to be part of his defense consultancy work, but the general didn't bite. Unfortunately, we can't reach him for comment. General Burke died in 2019. Julian Lease told me that the meeting was highly possible, that his father knew a lot of very important American industrialists, and that there were rumors, never substantiated, that his father might have worked for MI6, the British Secret Service. So, let's break down Jeffrey's ladder climbing so far. He went from math tutor to investment banker to arms dealer, and now he's going to take the next step. Beyond access to people at the highest levels of government, in the deepest recesses of arms dealing, Lease introduced Jeffrey to yet another world that intersected with these. One of aristocracy and socialites, some of whom had faced financial problems. What happened next is critical. This is discovery number 3. Find the dupe. Jeffrey begins a pattern of behavior that would make him a fortune. The key to Jeffrey's wealth was that he got rich people to trust him. He'd befriend rich investors, ingratiate himself by offering his so-called expertise, trick them into handing over total control of their money, and then steal millions from them, right under their noses. And he would do it again, and again, and again. But he was never exposed. Why? Well, it turns out rich people don't like admitting they've been duped. So Jeffrey did tell me that in the 1980s he had been some sort of financial bounty hunter. And he told Stuart Pivar, his friend the art dealer, that he worked for the government. I thought that sounded ludicrous.
One of my clients, as I'd gone through some of the numbers, I realized that there was a significant amount of money missing. And I had tracked it down, discovered how it was done, and...
Did you need any help from the FBI or anything with that?
No.
Or you just did it
No,
yourself?
I don't. My job, my goal was to get my client's money back. I am part of the Justice Department, specifically there to recover someone's money who had been misappropriated.
See, Jeffrey figured out that many wealthy people often didn't pay sufficient attention to numbers. They were therefore vulnerable to being cheated by their bankers or accountants. He was proud of this next part of his resume. Here's what he told me he was doing after he left Bear Stearns.
My job in those days to just point it out to the principal whose money it was, but most people who have their money, if they are defrauded, prefer not to go to the police. They prefer to get their money back.
Right. I can see why.
The police don't usually get your money back. The person goes to jail, but you don't get money.
Jeffrey smugly told me a story that took place at New York's 21 Club in the early 1980s.
I took a private room, and the person that which we'll refer to today as the fraudster.
Right.
Terminology is people who commit fraud.
He wouldn't tell me who the fraudster was, but I later found out that he was a British banker.
Extremely successful.
And well known?
Very.
Jeffrey had found out that this fraudster had been stealing money from his clients. So when he took the fraudster to lunch, he brought along a former assistant U.S. attorney.
I told someone, the fraudster, I was bringing my friend. As we sat down, he asked, "Who's this person?" I introduced him to so-and-so, and he said, "Well, who's he?" I said, "Well, he's the former U.S. attorney in charge of certain things." And he said, "Well, what's he doing here?" And I handed the fraudster a slip of paper with his secret Swiss bank account number on it, with his signing codes.
Wow.
And now at that moment, the waiter came over to the table and said, "Mr. Epstein, what will you people be having? What would your guests like for lunch?"
Right.
Or dinner, actually. And I pointed to the former U.S. attorney. I said, "He will have steak and potatoes. I will have steak and potatoes. And I'm afraid he," pointing to the fraudster, "will need a new change of underwear." It was only funny because from the 21 does not serve peanut butter, but the fraudster couldn't get his tongue off the roof of his mouth. All I kept hearing was the click of a dry mouth, tongue clicking, as he tried to get some sound out. So that's the villain.
So tell me something. But now, what happens then? So presumably you were working. You had been hired by whoever this person's chairman or CEO was.
Okay. This is the off-the-record part.
Yeah.
Yeah. I explained to this person, who was extremely successful, that he had now reached a crossroads in his life. And remember, he has this white ashen face. And I said he could spend the next couple of years having his children respect, and his wife probably still respect him. His mistress, which I also knew about, would never know that what a bad guy he really was. But to get down that road, there would be a toll. This was that. In that fork there was a toll down the road, which means he had to return the money. The other road, now I'm going to, this is off the record, would be he would be bent over probably some gymnasium bench until his asshole looked like grape jelly.
It's a vulgar, self-serving story. But here's what Jeffrey did not tell me about this bounty hunting adventure. A fact that reveals him to be as much of a thief as the people he claimed he was tracking down. Here's the story. Jeffrey had indeed spent a couple of years in the early 1980s working for a group of wealthy Spanish families. He grew especially close with one of the families and was very friendly with their movie star daughter, Ana Obregón. He stayed at their lavish homes, including the family mansion on the island of Majorca. It had underwater lights so they could all go spearfishing at night in the ocean. With the same kind of transactional mindset he'd later exhibit with Ghislaine, Jeffery found a way to get rich off of this friendship. The families had lost tens of millions of dollars in what was called at the time the Drysdale securities fraud. Jeffery presented himself as a kind of inverse Robin Hood. He told the family and the others that if anyone could find their stolen money, he could. He'd recently formed a new company, he explained, International Assets Group, his first business venture after leaving Bear Stearns. Anna was impressed. What she didn't know was that the firm was a one-man operation that Jeffery was running out of his living room. Robert Gold, the white-collar securities lawyer, was representing Anna Obregon's family. Gold hired Jeffery, who did find some of the Spaniards' missing money. And Jeffery took it upon himself to deal with it personally, like something out of a spy novel. In a dramatic scene, Jeffery flew to the Cayman Islands and recovered some of the stolen bearer bonds, around $40 million worth, from the Bank of Nova Scotia Cayman. Bearer bonds are fixed income instruments whose certificates do not contain the holder's personal information. So if you were in possession of them, you owned them, just like cash, because nobody's name is on it. As soon as Jeffery got the briefcase, he flew to Miami, and from there to Switzerland, where the money was deposited into 2 banks. Back in 2002, Gold had told me that he thought Jeffery had done, quote, God's work in this case. In fact, he'd marveled at Jeffery's brilliance. Well, here's what I only just discovered, and apparently Gold didn't know. Jeffery's clients never got their money. And here's why. In those days, due to extremely strict exchange controls, the Obregons and the other families couldn't take out more than $10,000 from the Swiss bank account Jeffery had deposited their money in. Jeffery's idea was a setup for a major manipulation. He'd persuaded Anna and the other Spanish families to give him power of attorney. Yep, that's right. He would be responsible for their money. But, surprise, surprise, after they'd granted him power of attorney, he never relinquished it. Jeffery simply refused to take their phone calls. So when I asked Jeffery about Joseph Osorio, the mastermind financier who had scammed the Spanish families and who'd served time in prison for it, it's no surprise that Jeffery was cagey.
He's a dangerous guy, by the way.
Who is?
Osorio. That's the reason I hesitate to confirm any of those things.
Well, he's out now, you mean?
Yes, he's out.
But it wasn't only Joseph Osorio who was, quote, dangerous. Jeffery was already proving quite adept at charming and fleecing the very rich. Which leads us to Jeffery's partner in crime, literally. That's Steve Hoffenberg, who we met before and we'll hear more about in the next episode. You can think of Hoffenberg as a foil in some ways to the high society Douglas Lease.
Jeffery could build Towers Financial substantially in funding, selling securities and doing business illegally. And that building of an empire could be used to convert it from misconduct to being a very viable company with a very great future for its investors. And Jeffrey Epstein had a detailed plan, project to do that. And I was stupid enough to go along with this.
Think about that for a moment. Jeffery admitted to Hoffenberg that he had manipulated and stolen from former clients, that he was planning on doing it again, that he was hoping to find new clients to lie to steal from, to launder their money. But instead of turning Jeffery over to the FBI, Hoffenberg hired him. left off, Jeffrey Epstein had amassed his fortune. The fortune that made him so appealing to a newly impoverished Ghislaine after her father had died in 1991. Now, Jeffrey had done this through a series of illegal power moves, and in the last episode, we made 3 big discoveries about those. First, Jeffrey left Bear Stearns for reasons he did not want out there. Second, Jeffrey learnt to hide money from a secret mentor, the defense contractor Douglas Lease. Third, Jeffrey managed money for people he felt he could, quote, dupe, especially through taking power of attorney. And in 1987, he had just been hired by Stephen Hoffenberg, the founder of Towers Financial. So let's come back to you. Why did you hire Jeffrey?
Stupidity.
Okay, but now you have the benefit of hindsight. A lot of hindsight. But if you can put yourself in your shoes back then, back in 1987, what did a younger, more naive version of you see in him?
Very deep-rooted greed and stupidity on my part to go near Jeffrey Epstein or this assortment of criminals.
So remember, Hoffenberg would end up running an enormous Ponzi scheme. $450 million, the biggest in American history before Bernie Madoff. Hoffenberg was convicted in 1995, so he was still in prison serving a 20-year sentence when I was reporting in 2002. So once I learned of his partnership with Jeffrey, which was not something that Jeffrey advertised, by the way, I wrote to the warden of the Federal Medical Center in Devens, Massachusetts. I asked if Steve Hoffenberg would see me. I was told very quickly that he would. So one sunny fall day, I found myself flying to Boston and catching a cab for the short trip to Devens. Prison visit rules stipulate that you have to dress as unprovocatively as possible. And I was now 5 or so months pregnant with twins, so it was a little tricky to hide my curves. I got some strange looks from the corrections officers as they patted me down. But then I was led through the hallways and into a rec area where all the inmates would gather for breaks, all dressed in their orange jumpsuits. It was slightly surreal. I was shown to a little room off to one side. And then voila, Steve Hoffenberg entered. He was tall, thin, and he had wispy graying hair. But most strikingly, he had a big grin on his face. He couldn't have been more pleased to see me. He was dying to talk about Jeffrey. And I was dying to hear what he had to say. So we sat there and we chatted. I took notes because tape recorders weren't allowed in the prison. Hoffenberg wanted our conversation to be off the record. This wasn't surprising. He was afraid of Jeffrey. But he was also obsessed with him. What Jeffrey had done to him. By the time I left the prison, believe it or not, I felt sorry for Steve Hoffenberg. And he then started to write to me from time to time. And we've stayed in touch throughout the years. Now that Jeffrey's dead, though, Steve Hoffenberg will answer all of my questions on the record.
To you, I mean, you were already in prison. Do you think he would have tried? What could he have done to you?
I had a risk, a danger from all the transactions that I knew about pertaining to Jeffrey Epstein and his business.
I'm Vicky Ward, and this is Chasing Ghislaine. Episode 6, Playing the Box. It was an eye-opening prison visit. Hoffenberg took me through a whole chapter of Jeffrey's career that Jeffrey had most definitely wanted to keep quiet. So Jeffrey and Hoffenberg were similar. Self-made men who were willing to cut corners. Both of them had rough edges, and both of them had thick Brooklyn accents. Now, outwardly, this looks like we are millions of miles away from the glittering world of a young Ghislaine Maxwell. But it's relevant to her story because the money that Jeffrey could make off of Hoffenberg would form the first layer of serious wealth that would attract other rich people into his web. Critically, Ghislaine. According to Hoffenberg, he and Ghislaine never met, although Ghislaine most certainly knew about his existence. At least that's according to Hoffenberg and one other source. But Hoffenberg, for the most part, was somebody who Jeffrey wanted kept a complete secret. Unlike Jeffrey's other mentor, Douglas Leese, Hoffenberg had little, if any, veneer of respectability. He reminded people more of a gangster than of a suave Cary Grant. And even though Hoffenberg was politically connected, Governor Mark White of Texas and Congressman Tom Evans of Delaware were on the board of Towers Financial. Hoffenberg was never accepted as a member of New York's establishment.
I thought he was a fairly scary person.
Ed Epstein is the journalist who was close with both Jeffrey and Ghislaine. He met Hoffenberg.
This guy was a true criminal. He carried a gun. He had a bodyguard. He was a large-scale character. And so he was sort of Jeffrey's first entry into the multi-million-dollar sphere.
They must have looked like a bit of a strange couple, two Brooklyn-born outsiders on the fringe of high society. But Jeffrey planned to turn Towers Financial, which was chiefly a debt collector,
into a financial powerhouse of funding money products around the world. And Jeffrey Epstein had a detailed plan, project to do that. And I was stupid enough to go along with this.
Stupid enough, Hoffenberg says, because Jeffrey wanted to do this illegally. Separately, Jeffrey told Hoffenberg he wanted to use the network of rich people that he was building for his political influence campaign, also for his own financial gain. The idea was that he'd target those who he considered were, quote, not fastidious, and whom he could therefore rip off, and especially those who would not likely go to the authorities. On a bit of a bad phone line during the pandemic, I asked Hoffenberg about how exactly Jeffrey planned to do this.
Say he has 4 clients. Each one invests with him. He basically robs Peter to pay Paul. He keeps juggling them around. But where he actually makes his money, the pot that goes to the Jeffrey Epstein Corporation, is from the fixed investments. And basically he gets these people to trust him so much, he's the only one who's reporting on their assets to them. So he will tell them, for example, I've invested in a $50 million property in the middle of nowhere in the Caribbean. But in fact, the property would only be worth $25 million, and Jeffrey had taken the other $25 million into Jeffrey and Co. That's what you said in 2002. Does that ring a bell?
That's an example of a process that he would use. The numbers would have to be verified by appraisals on the properties if they were real estate, but that's how he operated his business, by inflating the assets.
In order for that to work, these people would have to give him complete control because he couldn't have someone checking over his shoulder.
Well, it's not exactly that way. He had authority from these people as a manager to do transactions, not to put the money in his pocket. He had the authority to direct the bank to invest the client's monies into different transactions.
Right. Why was he telling you this? Why were you going to help him?
Well, he was always brainstorming with me as to his plans of making money.
Hoffenberg told me that Jeffrey had a name for his manipulations. Playing the box. Now, essentially, this means locking down all four corners of the deal so that it's impossible for your deception to be exposed. A frequent tactic was to own his victims to the point that even if they discovered the fraud, there was absolutely nothing that they could do about it.
I recall the conversations where Jeffrey Epstein said he was going to manipulate, rig, or fix, or tamper with the four corners of the transactions so that he could keep money for himself.
And you call this playing the box?
Well, the box is the four-corner terminology used on this type of illegal transaction, playing or rigging or manipulating the box, which is the transaction.
Did he tell you when you were hiring him and when you were talking about, playing the box and taking money from people, did he tell you that he'd already done that?
He did explain to me, and without pinpointing conversations 20 years ago or 25 years ago, he did explain to me what he was doing on taking the money and money laundering and the crimes, yes.
So Hoffenberg hired Jeffrey after he learned all about Jeffrey's talent as a criminal mastermind. That was exactly why Hoffenberg hired him. But Hoffenberg didn't put Jeffrey on the tower's payroll, however. Jeffrey was a consultant whose grand office space on Madison Avenue Hoffenberg paid for. This, by the way, was Jeffrey's idea. It was to avoid paying income tax, according to Hoffenberg. So all this was in the late 1980s. Even at the peak of his success, Steve Hoffenberg was not considered the kind of associate one would have boasted about on Wall Street. The receptionists at Towers Financial packed heat. Now, as I've said before, Hoffenberg is a tricky source. The judge's sentencing memorandum in his fraud case noted that his repeated lies had rendered him completely untrustworthy. However, most of what he told me back in that prison cell has subsequently completely checked out. It was Hoffenberg who told me where to find the truth of why Jeffrey had left Bear Stearns. Hoffenberg told me to find the depositions from the SEC investigation of Bear Stearns. And remember, Hoffenberg had been sitting in prison telling me all this because he believed that the way Jeffrey had been able to manipulate him was both absolutely masterful and personally devastating. Hoffenberg is definitely not an innocent, but Jeffrey used that to his advantage. So this whole saga began back in the late 1980s. This is the time period when Jeffrey allegedly may have been meeting sporadically with Robert Maxwell. It's also when he's allegedly working with Douglas Leese and getting involved in what Hoffenberg describes somewhat nebulously as, quote, national security issues. Julian Leese says that his father and Jeffrey stopped working together by the late 1980s, though he does admit that his father was in contact and working with Hoffenberg. Jeffrey and Hoffenberg came up with a financial plan, which was to bid on two airlines, Pan Am and Emory Air Freight. But to make those bids, they needed money, which they didn't have. So they purchased the parent company of two Illinois insurance firms, and they then used the bonds of the insurers as collateral to raise money on Wall Street. This is a completely illegal use of insurance bonds. But why go to all the trouble to bid on these two airlines? What was the point?
I believe he wanted to transport drugs and illegal assets by Emory Airport, and I believe he wanted to move the money around in illegal money transactions.
Owning a freight airline would be a useful vehicle for laundering money, guns, diamonds, you name it. But this greed is what brought about Hoffenberg's downfall. He wasn't watching his back. To win the bid, Jeffery set up various brokerage accounts through Hoffenberg's company, Towers Financial. Then he used those accounts to favorably manipulate the airline's stock. Now this is playing the box. All of this is in court records. Hoffenberg says that Jeffery effectively had autonomy over these brokerage accounts. Now remember, they're in the name of Towers Financial. Sound familiar? It's exactly the same way that Jeffery stole from his Spanish clients years earlier.
Because he opened up accounts for Towers Financial and transferred monies into those accounts for years from the company and from investors, both from transactions.
But how could he do that without your knowledge?
I didn't have anything to do with approving transfers for those accounts. Jeffrey Epstein was autonomous with that and with whatever else he did, which the documents and the evidence will show, that I wanted to explain to the court, that I asked to explain to Judge Abrams repeatedly. That's in the grand jury record.
The grand jury record that Hoffenberg is referring to is from 1993. As perhaps seems obvious now, Towers Financial was facing a number of criminal investigations from these, well, criminal activities. In his grand jury testimony, Hoffenberg described Jeffery as both the mastermind behind the insurance bond scheme and also the, quote, technician of a stock manipulation scheme on Wall Street. Hoffenberg described his own role as hardly that of a supporting cast member. As Hoffenberg's legal troubles deepened, poof, Jeffery was suddenly gone. His name never showed up again in the ongoing criminal investigations into Towers Financial. Prosecutors said that the company was running a $450 million Ponzi scheme, as well as the illegal scheme involving the Illinois insurance bonds. But here's what Hoffenberg didn't realize. Jeffery had left Hoffenberg high and dry. Behind Hoffenberg's back, Jeffery had cooperated with the government. And it gets worse. If you're Hoffenberg, that is. He claims that all along Jeffery was taking vast sums out of Towers Financial, all behind Hoffenberg's back.
I have calculated and added up some $100 million from various corners of the page, besides just the brokerage accounts that Jeffrey Epstein was involved in looting from Towers Financial with others. Not Jeffrey Epstein alone, but he was intimately involved with Towers Financial after I left Towers Financial, throughout two, including the year 2000.
Hoffenberg says that the transfers happened through brokers at Bear Stearns and other places, all while he was tied up with litigation. And there was nothing that Hoffenberg could do about this. He says that tactically he had made a very important mistake. He had pled guilty. This meant that there was no trial and that the government limited its discovery and its interest in other people. You may not know this, but when a person pleads guilty, the person loses certain rights. In criminal courts, those are, first, the right to counsel if unrepresented. Second, the right to a jury trial. Third, the right not to incriminate themselves. And fourthly, the right to confront and cross-examine their accusers. In Hoffenberg's case, it also left him less time. Time to give the government proof of Jeffrey's alleged role in Towers Financial. At least the role that Hoffenberg claims Jeffrey played.
He would have been exposed earlier on if I didn't plead guilty.
You had pled guilty very early on, thereby removing the need for the government to do huge amounts of discovery.
Yes. Which stopped the government needing to expose Jeffrey Epstein.
In March 1993, Towers Financial filed for bankruptcy, and Hoffenberg would eventually be sent to jail for almost 20 years. Ghislaine, meanwhile, is Jeffrey's girlfriend, or chief girlfriend. She knows about Hoffenberg's existence, but never met him, according to Hoffenberg. And Jeffrey's other big lifeline, Les Wexner, certainly didn't know about Hoffenberg at the time. At least Jeffrey told Hoffenberg that he was being kept a secret. Hoffenberg would most certainly have hurt Jeffrey's reputation with Wexner, and with all the other big shots that Jeffrey was now courting. Apparently, it didn't occur to Hoffenberg that Jeffrey would secretly cooperate with the government against him, or that Jeffrey would siphon off Towers' money behind his back. But it probably should have. Hoffenberg knew who Jeffrey was when he hired him. He knew what his MO was: gain your clients' complete trust, and then take their money. Jeffrey played the box on Hoffenberg.
I was taken aback and understood that Jeffrey Epstein was motivated to use me the same as he used everybody else.
You thought you were different?
I never suspected the degree of monstrous behavior, the degree of misconduct, the degree of victimizing me, the degree of setting me up, executed by Jeffrey Epstein. I did not at any time believe that that would occur.
Skeptics often point out that there's something about Hoffenberg's allegations that doesn't sound entirely plausible, even with all his explanations. Why would anyone agree to go to jail for almost 20 years and let Jeffrey walk off with his money without putting up more of a fight? Yet my gut feeling is that Hoffenberg has nothing to gain by lying at this point. These days, he cuts a pale, thin figure that's a far cry from who he once was. It's clear that he desperately needs money. It's also clear that he likes the relevance and the attention that the Epstein story has brought him. But any money he gets from this, he must, legally, return to the victims of Towers Financial. You can tell when you talk to him that he is still very, very angry with Jeffrey Epstein, and a little frustrated that journalists are skeptical about what he has to say.
Nobody's telling the truth anymore. Everybody is saying, no, that's not what happened. But meanwhile, the evidence shows what Jeffrey Epstein did. There's a preponderance of evidence that shows what he did. There's no question of what he did. Everything Jeffrey Epstein says is a fiction, a lie. You know that. You dealt with him one-to-one. He's a liar, pathological liar.
The evidence he's talking about is in the Tower bankruptcy records, so he says. We tried to get hold of those, but unfortunately at the time of this recording, they are in storage in the National Archive in Kansas, and due to the pandemic, they are temporarily closed. Hoffenberg finished his prison sentence in 2016. He started emailing me almost daily about a lawsuit against Jeffrey that was an effort to get money back for the Tower's victims. And soon after he got out of jail, he went to see Jeffrey.
My wife and I were there. We knocked on the doors.
That's Hoffenberg's lawyer, Gary Bays. Hoffenberg told Gary that he could use Jeffrey's apartment in Paris on an upcoming trip. So together they went to Jeffrey's house in New York to ask him.
And frankly, I wanted to see just how close this guy was to Epstein. I'd heard all these stories. But we walked over, I think it's 72, and I think it has J.E. on either the front
J.E. on, yes, it does. Yes, it did.
Either on the front or on the side, inside. Anyway, a lady comes to the door. He introduces himself, introduces my wife and myself. And I think he fully expected we would go in and see Mr. Epstein. Well, this lady comes back and says, in essence, in fact, I think her exact quote was, Mr. Epstein will not see you. I thought maybe it was just because, as a lawyer, I was with him, but we were not allowed past the door.
How did Mr. Hoffenberg react?
Sort of laughed about it. I think laughingly embarrassed, because I truly think that he felt that Mr. Epstein would see us, or we wouldn't have done it. That would be my guess. I don't know, but it was slightly embarrassing, sure.
It's really hard to hear this and not feel for Hoffenberg. If 1/10 of what he says is true about Jeffrey Epstein, the indignities that he has suffered because of his association with him are really something. I mean, Hoffenberg was no angel, and it was his choice to hire Jeffrey. But wow, has he paid the price over and over and over?
My wife died because of this.
She did?
Yes,
When you were in jail?
right after I got out.
Because of the stress?
Yes.
That's very, very sad.
This is a tragedy. A tragedy that I'm just trying to explain. My wife died over this case. And it's a tragedy. And I'm the scapegoat, the mark for Jeffrey Epstein.
Unsurprisingly, Jeffrey was extremely annoyed when I found out in 2002 about his connection to Hoffenberg. Here's the first time that I brought it up with him.
What I want to ask you is what your relationship with Hoffenberg was.
Okay.
You know, there are court documents showing that he paid you a consulting fee of 25 grand, and you know there are financial statements showing that he gave you loans and things.
He gave me loans?
Yes, there are records of this.
No. But if all his records... No. Maybe. There's no court document that's my name on it.
Yes, there are.
From his company?
Yeah.
It wouldn't be his. His records were frozen. That's why he went to jail.
So you can hear he's defensive. He definitely did not want me to know what had really gone on between Hoffenberg and him. Next, we're talking about the bid for Pan Am and Emery Airlines.
I had a tremendous amount of money, he said, to do the deal. And like all his financial statements, it turned out to be fraudulent.
Sorry, who had a tremendous amount of money to do the deal?
Hoffenberg. He scammed a lot of people, but I don't think you'll find a loan to me.
I know what a source close to him claims that he did make you a loan.
Say much. Co-cellmate. I don't think he's made a loan to anybody.
Is it true that he, though, paid the rent on your offices in the Villard house?
No, of course not.
So then what happened after Pan Am and Emery? I mean, after those bids?
He went to jail.
In another conversation, I showed my hand. I explained that I had court documents as evidence that he was financially tied to Hoffenberg. I told Jeffrey that they showed quite plainly that he'd received monthly payments from Hoffenberg and that he'd also received a loan for $2 million.
Are you going to write that there's something not right?
Well, I need to ask you.
That wasn't the question. Are you alleging that there was something not right?
Well, we're not. There are certain things, and those things I have to ask you.
Okay. Go ahead.
Now I had to ask Jeffrey about his involvement with some of the things that I knew Hoffenberg had done, and for which Hoffenberg sat in prison as we spoke. I had to ask about the scheme to use insurance bonds for the Pan Am and Emery airline bids.
So did you have any idea that Hoffenberg took bonds out of Illinois to New York?
I don't know. Most of his transactions? No.
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 Okay, and did you ever get asked by the regulators or the insurance companies where those assets were?
Where his what?
Well, my understanding is that Hoffenberg financed Pan Am and Emery by taking bonds out of two insurance companies.
He never financed Pan Am and Emery.
He never financed them?
No, he never went ahead. He had no money.
But no, one of the things that he got indicted for...
Right.
...was raping those two insurance companies.
Yeah, but that had nothing to do with Pan Am or
But he claims they were. That's why I have to ask you about this.
Yes, he went around basically saying that he had a great deal of money to be able to finance a Pan Am transaction, and he was buying, I think, airplanes and boats. And now it turned out that all those monies, I believe, were stolen from an insurance company, or he took the insurance company money and put it in his own pocket.
Okay. So you were never aware, and no one ever asked you to give testimony, or...
No, I was never called.
By the way, I've recently discovered that this was one more piece of total bullshit. According to a source who must remain anonymous, Jeffrey did spend 3 days testifying to a grand jury about all of this. Ghislaine even booked Jeffrey into a very expensive suite in Chicago in the early 1990s, where he stayed during his testimony. Unfortunately, I don't have access to it. Grand jury testimonies are typically sealed. I didn't know that at the time of this conversation. But my reporter's spidey sense was tingling, so I kept pressing him on it.
I wasn't involved in that whole trial or anything.
I know, but
Not even as a witness. Nobody.
Did the insurance companies never ask you?
No.
So you were never involved with a plan where the insurance companies purchased treasury bonds for $500,000 that looked like it was free and clear when in fact it was collateralized?
By the way, executives from the insurance companies told me on the record that they'd asked Jeffrey about the bonds because they knew that he was involved with them.
No, again, I wasn't involved in anything financially that he did. He said he had a great deal of money behind him to be able to finance this bid. He had the union leaders of Pan Am,
right,
with John Lehman, Secretary of the Navy, in an office. He said he was willing to finance it. How would you go about structuring a takeover? So, nothing to do with the money.
I finally tracked down John Lehman and asked him about Jeffrey's claims. Lehman told me that he'd had nothing to do with the financing of Pan Am. He explained that at the time he had recently retired from politics and consulted briefly, just for a few months, with Towers. And then he took a job at an investment bank. He did recall that Hoffenberg had asked him his views on Pan Am. Since Lehman had some industry knowledge, Hoffenberg asked him if he'd be the CEO, but that's as far as the discussions went. Lehman doesn't recall meeting Jeffrey. But hey-ho, Jeffrey never let the truth get in the way of his version of events. Here's more.
So you never got involved with any of the you were never just involved with this sort of
External strategy. I didn't know where the money was coming. I had no idea what his money situation was. I thought he had a lot of money.
So an allegation that was made was that you manipulated the stock price of Emery Air Freight to minimize losses by selling one client's account, let's say $6 a share, and getting someone else to buy it at $6 a share when the market price might have been $5 a share.
That's ridiculous.
But that was what was in Hoffenberg's grand jury testimony.
Okay, and the other allegation...
What was the allegation, even? I don't understand the allegation.
Well, that you manipulated the stock price of Emery Air Freight to minimize losses.
For who?
For Hoffenberg.
No, definitely not. I had nothing to do with the finances of the company. The people basically... he called me in to say that he wanted my advice on how to structure a takeover. That's basically it. But I had no idea where the money was coming from, except that he seemed to have had a lot of it.
In fact, a source tells me that the genesis of the Pan Am bid came from Jeffrey, not Hoffenberg. That's because a close friend of Jeffrey's had fed him inside information on the struggling airline's increasingly dire performance. In another conversation, Jeffrey threatened to sue me personally over what I might write about his association with Hoffenberg. Remember, my conversations with Jeffrey were originally off the record, but we're releasing them now because of the public interest. Note how he also brings up the Farmer Sisters here.
You put in whatever you want, and if I don't like it, I'll sue you guys. I'm not doing that. No way. Our off the record is really off the record.
Okay.
I wanted to be helped, even in terms of... because my mother's sick, I had to come back down here. I couldn't do photographs. I've been trying to be helpful by sending you guys some photographs.
I understand.
I don't want to be...
I understand.
But tell me, the farmer stuff?
The stuff we talked about. How can I rebut it if you're not... Do you see what I'm saying? How can I rebut it if I'm not on the record? Do you want me to say a spokesperson for Jeffrey says...
No, I don't. I think you should... Look, you take the... I don't know what you're writing. Basically, you paraphrase some of it to me. If there's any implication of wrongdoing, I will take legal action against you personally. I'm telling you so you understand. I will be as harsh as I possibly can personally. Not for the magazine, but you, because I had this discussion with you. This relationship is with you.
No, it isn't, Jeffrey. I'm a professional journalist doing a job for the magazine.
I'm telling you, I want you to be clear. My relationship with you is friendly. If you
Jeffrey,
decide...
I'm doing this as a job. This is not...
you might not... you shouldn't risk your future as a job.
I'm not risking anything. I'm doing my job to report. To report. And this is not about a personal thing. This is about doing a professional job. That's why I was put on this assignment. And that is what And I'm doing an assignment for Vanity Fair.
I'm clear. The concept of having an allegation that basically... You have to make the decision as a journalist what you think are reliable sources.
Yes.
If you think you have a reliable source and a reliable allegation, you make it. I will hold you personally responsible. And I have a very long patience level. I think it's wrong. I've told you my side. I think you have an obligation to figure out a way to do it. I can't tell you how to do it. I'm not going on the record. And if you want to say, well, he refused to respond, I guess that's good enough for you, but I wouldn't do it if I were you. I mean, I've heard about the Hoffenberg stuff. You have someone who's spending time 18 years in jail for lying about financial statements and basically lying. And then you ask me a question about his financial statements, say this? How do you respond? He's in jail for bad stuff. He's in jail for filing bad financial statements.
Okay, so that will obviously be made clear.
So I wouldn't respond to a convicted felon making any allegation. And the thing about the Emery stock, which sort of says something about manipulation, is the same concept. I find it unbelievable that you would even listen to some of these people. I think it's unfair.
That's it for now. That's it. And I'm obviously going to report back to our lawyers, okay?
I'm sorry this has gotten this way.
You might imagine that by now I knew that I was dealing with somebody who was pretty much incapable of speaking the truth. Journalists are supposed to be objective, but when I think back up to that conversation, and I still remember it, it would be fair to say that at that moment I think I absolutely hated Jeffrey Epstein. But here's what I kept wondering. Why was he so reluctant to talk about Hoffenberg, Lease, any of his past? Why did he lie and lie and lie? Something about his mendacity and his secrecy really niggled me. It was just a part of the puzzle. In fact, many parts that I just hadn't solved yet. It bugged the hell out of me. So here's what I think now, based on my new reporting, and also what we know about Jeffrey that we didn't in 2002. Of course, Jeffrey wanted Hoffenberg locked up and shut away. Because in the 1990s, Jeffrey was about to put into practice what the two of them had plotted. We now know that a lot of wealthy so-called Epstein clients would later claim that Jeffrey made them a lot of money, and then they'd discover that he'd also taken some of it, and they'd have a fight with him about that. Hoffenberg wasn't just somebody who collaborated with Jeffrey's financial crimes. He was a witness to the crimes. So Jeffrey discarded Hoffenberg as cleanly as he could. And then he turned to his next target. He was looking for very rich individuals to either help them find stolen money or fix bad investment schemes. And he was going to take some of that money for himself. He was about to play the box. What he needed was somebody who would introduce him to billionaires. Well, we know now who that was. Ghislaine Maxwell. Hoffenberg says that Jeffrey told him that his relationship with Ghislaine was about much more than just romance.
Did Jeffrey explain why he was attracted to Ghislaine?
Yes.
What was the answer?
Jeffrey was impressed with Robert Maxwell's businesses and the size of Robert Maxwell's investments and the relationships that Robert Maxwell had around the world. And that impressed Jeffrey Epstein greatly with Ghislaine Maxwell, who became a very important part of Jeffrey Epstein's business and assisted Jeffrey Epstein in securing millions and millions and millions of dollars.
Remember, as far as the Maxwell family is aware, according to a source with knowledge, Jeffrey met Ghislaine in 1991. But Hoffenberg also says that Jeffrey knew Ghislaine's father, Robert Maxwell, in the 1980s. He's echoing Ari Ben Menashe, Amer Pasha, and Ed Epstein.
He knew Maxwell from Wall Street, from his travels on Wall Street, because Robert Maxwell was involved in many efforts in the United States at that time. And that's, don't forget, Jeffrey was at Bear Stearns, was an investment banker, and had exposure to people in Robert Maxwell's circle for many decades.
So we interviewed some of Robert Maxwell's biographers who say that there's no trace of Jeffrey Epstein's name in Robert Maxwell's, contacts book. Why do you think that is?
Well, because Jeffrey was lower profile at that time. Jeffrey was always off the radar and was not trying to become important to the media. That wasn't what his interest was. But there's no question of his involvement with the Maxwell family and the causes that they represented. There's no doubt of that.
So as we know, Jeffrey started to cozy up to Ghislaine, befriend her, build trust, allegedly intertwine their finances, their personal lives, and eventually, if the prosecutors are to be believed, their crimes. Sound familiar?
I did have confidence in Jeffrey Epstein and underestimated gigantically his betrayal of me.
So Hoffenberg left prison only a few years before Ghislaine was arrested. If one is to believe him, he's paid a very hefty price for his association with Jeffrey, just as Ghislaine could, depending on the outcome of her trial. But there are those who haven't. Will they ever? Or will they just slide under the radar?